Chapter 310. Nan Hung could not stand Officer Ince's cautious personality. Without thinking, he abruptly pulled out his gun and fired at Dolly's leg. At the same time as his gunshot, another gunshot rang out. It was Feng Ling, who was standing by Jin Wan's side. She had fired accurately and moved at the same frequency as him. The bullet also struck Dolly's other leg at the same time. Dolly's face contorted in pain. He was still half a meter away from the gun on the ground, but he still had to struggle to reach it. Mo Jingshun endured the pain and stood up, rushing forward. Meanwhile, Dolly was still crawling on the ground. The moment Mo Jingshun picked up the gun, his gaze shifted. He only hesitated for half a second before pulling the trigger and aiming it at Dolly's forehead. Nan Hung furrowed his brows and abruptly leaped forward. Pung! A sound. Nan Hang's shot directly struck Dolly's forehead. Pung! Another sound. Another hit. Pung! Another sound. It was Mo Jingshin who had accurately shot Dolly in the middle of his forehead when he was about to die, with his eyes wide open. Dolly's eyes instantly closed. He was completely dead. Fresh blood flowed down the grass beneath him. You? Nan Hang's hand stiffened. His gaze was astonished. Back then, Mo Jingshin had promised Elder Mo that he would not involve himself in the underworld, would not stain his hands with blood, and would not take human lives. But no matter how Nan Hung tried to stop him, he still killed Dolly with his own hands, and Mo Jingshin did not explain. As he tossed the gun aside, his gaze coldly stared at the dead man on the ground. His tone was mild. Come and defuse the bomb. Don't waste words. Nan Hung. He turned to look coldly at Officer Ince, who was still hesitating on whether to approach. By the time Officer Ince reacted and was about to call for help, the people from 11 Base had already rushed over. Jin Wan stood outside the crowd. Her hand was held tightly by Feng Ling. She looked at the man whose back was already soaked in blood. Her heart was filled with an indescribable feeling. She only felt that her eyes were instantly wet. Only she knew why Mo Jingshin insisted on killing Dolly with his own hands. Because when she was trapped in the camp for days, it was Dolly who kept beating her, kicking her, and threatening her. It was also Dolly who forced her to kneel down in front of Mo Jingshin to save her life. It was also Dolly who said he was going to use Jin Wan as an appetizer. This man had become a nightmare that Jin Wan couldn't get rid of in the short term. This spear shot at the brink of death was worth it. That plain white t-shirt was now stained with blood, and it was impossible to tell whose blood it was. Finally, the police rushed over and took away the children who needed to be taken away. Those who needed to be defused did so, and those who needed to check the bodies of Akib and his accomplices went to check the bodies. Jin Wan took the opportunity when Feng Ling's hand finally loosened a little to abruptly pull her hand out and rush toward him. There were policemen all around, and they all recognized her. No one intended to stop her. Mr. Mo, your injury is now. The people at the base were about to ask him to hurry back and bandage his wound. It's fine. Take these children away first. Mo Jingshun was covered in blood, and his eyes were cold. He just stood there, but no one dared to approach him. Jin Wan ran to his side, supported him, and asked anxiously, "How are you?" He seemed to realize that it was really Jin Wan who broke the deadlock and suddenly shot Akib in the back. Jin Wan pressed her hand against his arm and was about to continue speaking when she suddenly felt a pain in her hand. The man abruptly pulled her away and held her hand tightly in his palm. The pain made her face pale, and she looked at him in surprise. "What did I tell you before I left? Didn't I tell you to wait where you are?" The man's eyes were cold and sharp. When he looked at her, there was not the slightest warmth in his eyes. The coldness in his eyes made Jin Wan freeze on the spot. Her mouth moved, but for a moment, she couldn't speak. She couldn't explain a word. Should she say that she was worried about him? Or should she say something to coax him not to be angry? No matter what she said, she couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of his back. Jin Wan abruptly held his arm with force, holding on with all her might to prevent him from pushing her away. She said calmly, "The injury on your back can't be ignored anymore. Let's go back and find a doctor. His injury should be very serious." Earlier, not only did his wound tear, but he had also been attacked several times in the same spot. The injury that had already penetrated deep into his flesh was most likely even more serious now. Mo Jingshen did not move much before Jin Wan forcefully pulled him away. Jin Wan held him, passing by the terrible blood and mess on the ground. She did not even glance at it. She only wanted to take Mo Jingshen away from this place. The police and the people at the base were all busy. The gloomy weather that had been gloomy all morning suddenly became gloomy until it began to rain. Jin Wan raised her head to look up. As she supported Mo Jingshen toward the direction of the helicopter, she asked, "It's raining. Will there still be any danger of explosions here?" Yes. Most of the landmines here were buried during the war decades ago. The dense forest is thick with branches and leaves. The rain is not heavy, so it won't penetrate through. The ground is still dry. If the rain gets heavier, the areas that need to be exploded will still explode, but they won't be connected together. The area of explosion will shrink, and the forest won't be on fire. After speaking, Mo Jingshen suddenly coughed. Jin Wan rushed to support him. "Those children have been rescued. Leave the rest to the police. Let's go find a doctor first." Before she finished, all of a sudden, there was a pong sound from behind them. A gunshot. Very close. Jin Wan's entire body trembled. Before she could react, she was abruptly pressed into Mo Jingshen's arms. In the next moment, the bullet almost brushed past their shoulders and landed heavily on the helicopter, leaving a deep dent in the hard steel body. Jin Wan raised her head from Mo Jingshen's arms to see that Akib, who had been pretending to be dead for a long time, was lying on the ground covered in blood. With only one breath left, he actually took the opportunity when the police were dealing with the bomb on Dolly's body to shoot them. Thankfully, Feng Ling was close. She reacted quickly and fired at the same time, hitting Akib's wrist. This shot that was originally aimed at killing them was directly deflected. Following that, Feng Ling expressionlessly walked toward Akib step by step. She shot at various parts of his body. Akib's entire body twitched as the bullets continuously pierced through him. Finally, he breathed his last breath. Jin Wan looked at Akib, who was covered in bloody holes, and was completely stunned. It was not until the man who had been protecting her in his arms suddenly went limp and knelt on the ground that Jin Wan subconsciously raised her hand to hold him. Due to the difference in height and weight, she almost lost her balance and fell backward. She hurriedly tried to stand up. "Jingshen." Jin Wan hugged Mo Jingshen tightly as he suddenly fell on her. She felt the blood flowing down his back. Earlier, when he suddenly turned around to avoid the bullet, his wound had been aggravated by this movement. Chapter 3:11. "Mr. Mo, we'll take you back right away. The doctor is already waiting." Feng Ling came quickly and was about to help Jin Wan hold him. But Jin Wan had already stood firmly. She looked down at him and said clearly, "Mo Jingshen, if anything happens to you, I'll remarry with the child in my belly and let your child call someone else dad." Feng Ling. She suddenly felt it was not appropriate to reach out to help him. The man who fell on Jin Wan suddenly chuckled. He leaned against her shoulder and chuckled hoarsely. His voice was so hoarse and weak that it was almost breathless, but it was still full of threat. "How dare you? If anything happens to you, I'll dare to remarry. If you don't believe me, try it." Jin Wan resisted the sourness in her nose, hugged him tightly, gave Feng Ling a look, and helped Mo Jingshen into the helicopter with Feng Ling. "I'll call someone to send you back right away. We'll deal with the aftermath." Feng Ling helped Mo Jingshen sit in the helicopter with Jin Wan and then quickly walked out. Seeing the blood on Mo Jingshen's body, Jin Wan was about to lift his clothes to have a look, but her hand was held by the man and pulled down. Mo Jingshen sat on the soft chair in the airport, panted, and said without looking back, narrowed his eyes and narrowed his eyes. "What did you say just now? I'm not dead yet, and you're thinking of remarrying?" It was the first time she had seen Mo Jingshen injured like this. In the past, he had never even had a headache or fever in front of her. Suddenly, he was so weak that she was really afraid that something would happen to him. She was so anxious that she tried to threaten him to hold on. The man suddenly looked at her murderously. "Who do you dare to marry?" Jin Wan pursed her lips. The premise is that you don't die. You have to live well and keep an eye on me every day. Then I can't run away. She couldn't speak out her emotions. Seeing him injured like this, she couldn't get emotional at all, but she didn't want him to worry too much, so she could only try to calm down. Mo Jingshun looked at her sideways and saw the emotions she had been hiding. I won't die. He raised his hand with some difficulty and stroked her soft hair as usual. I am yours, and my life is also yours. I won't let go easily. Don't think too much. Tell Feng Ling that there's no rush to send us back. Defuse the bombs first. Earlier, the landmines around us didn't explode. The people from the base must have found the fuse and cut it off first. Now, the danger is mostly gone. Remember to negotiate with the Cambodian local police. There's still many landmines around. Tell them to be careful and not to get too close. Jin Wan listened attentively, nodding as she listened. She would convey the message to Feng Ling later. But his voice was getting softer and softer. In the end, there was only silence. She glanced sideways and saw that Mo Jingshun's eyes were closed. His face was pale, and his body was covered in blood. However, even though he had fainted, his hand still held hers without letting go. The danger in the jungle was finally over. When the helicopter took off, Mo Jingshun had already woken up. It was raining outside the cabin. Although the rain wasn't heavy, it did have a small effect. It delayed the detonation of the newly buried landmines underground, giving them more time to search and clear the mines. Akib and his men were all captured, dead, or injured. Have the children been sent back? Jin Wan asked. Regardless of whether it was Akib's death or Dolly's death, this group of evil people could not be treated as humans. Thus, even though she saw this bloody scene, she didn't feel much pity. She only sighed a little. However, the thing that weighed heavily on her heart was the innocent child who had died. Not yet. The base doctor will first treat the children's injuries before sending them back. We don't want to scare their parents, Feng Ling replied. 6 of the children have minor abrasions. One of them was shot in both legs. The bullet pierced through his leg bones. He's destined to be crippled for life. As for the one who was blown up, Feng Ling paused. Every time she was sent out on a dangerous mission, she was used to seeing life and death. However, she still couldn't bear to see innocent children get hurt, especially since the average age of these children was less than 6 years old. The dead can't be brought back to life. We'll think of a way to comfort their parents. We can give them some money or other ways to comfort them. Then leave more money. If the base doesn't have enough money, I can also provide some. I can still afford to help these children grow up, Jin Wan said. Feng Ling glanced at her, but didn't speak. All of a sudden, Jin Wan heard the man who had been resting by her side let out a low chuckle. It was very mild. She turned to look at Mo Jingshun. Why aren't you closing your eyes to rest? What are you laughing about? 11 Base is Nanhang's territory. He's a famous arms dealer in both the black and white worlds. His money is beyond your imagination. There's no need for you to do anything. Mo Jingshun's lips were slightly pale, and his voice was low. Nanhang was not on the plane right now. Jin Wan had no choice but to find something to distract herself. Otherwise, if she kept looking at the wound on Mo Jingshun's back, her heart would be in pain. Since he's so powerful, why does it seem like he's under your control? It seems like he doesn't dare to offend you at all. Jin Wan moved closer to Mo Jingshun's ear and whispered. She didn't want Feng Ling to hear these words, but Feng Ling's hearing was extremely good. Mo Jingshun's pale, handsome brows only moved slightly. He smiled lightly and didn't say anything. However, Feng Ling directly said, because Nanhang first mingled in the underworld in America. Now that he's able to traverse both the black and white worlds, it's all because of Mr. Mo. Without Mr. Mo's help, it wouldn't be so easy for him to clear his name. You mean that on the path of the underworld, no one can control Nanhang, but on the path of clearing his name, Mo Jingshun is the boss above him. Feng Ling pursed her lips. That's roughly what I mean. In other words, Nanhang is 11 Base's boss, and Mo Jingshun is Nanhang's boss. So, 11 Base also belongs to Mo Jingshun? You can say that. Jin Wan's expression suddenly changed. No wonder that day when I washed the socks, the group of people in your base had such expressions. Everyone knew that she was Mrs. M.O. She suddenly understood their feelings very well. What socks? M.O. Jingshin's voice suddenly interrupted Jin Wan and Feng Ling's conversation. This was not the first time he heard these words. M.O. Jingshin's gaze directly landed on Jin Wan's face. Feng Ling. She suddenly didn't dare to speak anymore. She only used her gaze to look at Jin Wan. Jin Wan wanted to use this matter to make a joke to ease her feelings, but she turned to look at the blood on the man's body. The scene of blood splattering everywhere from the gunshot earlier was still vivid in her mind. Chapter 312. The people of 11 Base were responsible for sending the children back to the farm. Everyone packed up and prepared to leave Tunnel Sap Lake before dark. Because of M.O. Jingshin's injuries and the other injured people's conditions, they had to go to the hospital in the Cambodian capital first and then return to America the next morning. Jinwan asked if she was going back to America with them. Nanheng only replied that M.O. Jingshin was going to America. Shouldn't she go? The answer was, of course, to go. At this moment, M.O. Jingshin sat on a chair in the Cambodian treatment room. The doctors and nurses kept making a fuss. Occasionally, they couldn't help but say a lot because of the severity of the injury on M.O. Jingshin's back. As they tended to his wounds, they stared at his incomparably handsome face and kept looking for opportunities to say more. Jinwan couldn't understand what they were talking about. When she saw the female doctor and nurse staring at M.O. Jingshin's face and back, her heart instantly felt as though a bottle of vinegar had been poured onto a flame. It was hot and sour. However, she couldn't act up at this moment. M.O. Jingshin's injuries were too serious. The doctors were tending to his wounds. She couldn't possibly run over to help him put on a shirt and then take him away from the hospital. However, no matter what the doctors and nurses were saying, and no one knew if M.O. Jingshin understood them or not, he just sat there quietly. When Jinwan suddenly got up to go out to take a breath, he stopped her. "Where are you going?" She looked at him. Although the man did not even frown when he was enduring the pain, his forehead was still slightly sweaty. He allowed the nurses to stitch up his wounds with tweezers and needle. Although the veins on the back of his hands were clearly visible, he did not make a sound. He only opened his eyes to look at her. "I'll go get a glass of water," Jinwan said, and went out to find a water dispenser. She would never say that it was because the nurses had been staring at his face and saying a lot of things. They helped him disinfect and leaned down to his shoulder to whisper softly into his ear. This scene almost knocked over her bottle of vinegar. It's not the right time to be jealous, but she doesn't understand their Cambodian language, which makes her even more nervous. She doesn't want them to be careless when treating the wound, so she just goes out for a walk. But Jinwan couldn't go out for too long. Feng Ling was outside. After chatting with Feng Ling for a while, she poured a glass of water and went back. Then, he held the cup of water and watched the scene inside. M.O. Jingshin's bloodstained shirt was tossed on the ground. His entire body was covered in dust, and there was an indistinct bruise on his brow bone. Because she was finally back, the man raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at her from the corner of his eye. He smiled faintly, as if he had already seen the jealousy in her eyes. He just sat there, dirty and disheveled, but damn handsome. This was the first time Jin Wan realized that a person's good looks did not only come from their clean and presentable appearance. Although M.O. Jingshin's appearance was indeed God's most outstanding creation, at this moment, this man's handsomeness was not the faint and noble appearance she was familiar with. Instead, it was the masculinity that flowed from his bones. He did not wear the expensive suit he usually wore, nor did he tidy up his incomparably handsome appearance. But right now, his attractiveness was fatal. Thus, it was understandable that these female doctors and nurses would be infatuated with him under the pretense of treating his wound. The stitching of his wound continued until 9:30 p.m. M.O. Jingshin finally put on his clothes. Before taking the plane back to America, everyone took the opportunity to relax and found a decent noodle shop near the hospital. They ordered several bowls of beef noodles to be delivered to the hospital. Because M.O. Jingshin's wound had been stitched up, he could not move for the time being. Thus, the task of feeding Boss Missouri food naturally fell onto Jinwan. Jinwan stood before M.O. Jingshin. As she stirred the noodles in the bowl, she said, "A few days ago, when I fed you food for the first time, you spilled the soup in the bowl." Mo Jingshin faltered. He could clearly sense that she wanted to settle the score with him later. Under those circumstances, it would only be a problem if I ate it. Although the two of them were well aware of this, he still explained. Jinwan immediately rolled her eyes at him. "Then when I fed you water, you should have continued to treat me coldly. Why did you suddenly tease me?" Mo Jingshin. Although she said that, Jinwan could not bear to let him starve right now. Right now, he was a heavily injured patient and needed to be taken care of. Mo Jingshin watched as the little woman carefully blew on the slightly hot noodles and then fed it to his mouth. He looked at her and chuckled lightly. "You didn't manage to feed me once or twice, so you have to find an opportunity to feed me again, right? Don't tell me you can't even lift your arms and shoulders right now." Jinwan directly pressed the noodles to his lips. "The doctor said that before the wound heals, you can't move your shoulders or back. Otherwise, it'll easily tear again. When that happens, it'll be difficult." The man looked at her serious expression and curved his lips. He gave her face and ate the noodles she fed him. Earlier, Jinwan had taken a few bites from the other bowl. The Cambodian people's taste was different from that in China. Although this noodle soup was made by a very good noodle restaurant near the hospital, she didn't like the taste in the noodle soup. It was sour, but not sweet, and it was salty. In short, she just couldn't get used to it. Thankfully, the broth was clean, and the noodles were relatively soft. Noodles nourished the stomach and were easy to digest. It was suitable for people who were temporarily injured and could not move around much. Thus, she had to think of a way to let him eat more. After the meal, the people from the base were already preparing to board the plane. Jinwan went to help with the luggage. Mo Jingshin did not stay idle either. He chatted with Nanhung and Officer Ince for a long time. When Jinwan went to look for him again, she happened to see an extremely bright light outside the helicopter casting a dazzling glow on his body. His expression was serene, as though nothing he had experienced in the past few days could disturb his calm and steady footsteps. She didn't know what Officer Ince had said to him, but he did not say a word. Only a hint of coldness appeared in his brows. Seeing that Jinwan had come over, Mo Jingshin listened to the doctor's advice and did not move. He only used his eyes to indicate for her to come over. Jinwan quickly approached him and stood in front of him. The lights fell on their bodies, and their shadows intertwined. Cambodia's winter was stifling and hot for many days. Tonight, it finally felt cooler. Jinwan faced the direction of Tunnel Sap Lake. Cambodia's night sky was silent. Only the bright stars twinkled. This country was very beautiful. Chapter 313. They finally set off for America. There were only 4 people on this plane: Jinwan, Feng Ling, Nanhung, and Mo Jingshin. Nanhung was covered in the smell of cigarettes. He had just extinguished a cigarette before boarding the plane. Recently, he had smoked more than usual. Feng Ling sat slightly further away from them. She sat in the seat in front, separated from the driver's seat, and chatted with Jinwan occasionally. Compared to the 2 women's voices, the 2 men in the cabin were much quieter. Nanhung calmly leaned against the seat, folding his arms like a master. He closed his eyes and prepared to sleep. Mo Jingshin turned his body. He could not move around frequently for the time being, so he lazily leaned against the window of the cabin and looked outside. The man's eyelashes cast a gentle shadow on his face. Jinwan almost forgot the thrill she had just experienced. She almost thought that she had just returned from a tropical country with Great Boss Missouri on a vacation and was on the return flight. This man always made people feel at ease. A sense of security, belonging, and stability. Everything came from him. Jinwan did not know when she had fallen asleep. When she woke up, her head was heavy. She could still hear the sound of the propeller by her ears. She was still on the plane, so she must not have slept for long. However, the dazzling light from the window indicated that they had already flown across half the world. In just a few hours of flight, they had passed through day and night. Originally, she had been feeling uncomfortable because of her morning sickness and other pregnancy symptoms, especially after flying for such a long time. However, Right now, she felt especially comfortable lying down. She came to her senses under the glaring light and came to her senses. She was lying on Mo Jingshan's lap. He was still injured. Jinwan rushed to climb up and turned to see the man's gaze landing on her face. Mo Jingshan pushed her slightly messy hair behind her ear, gently asking, "Why didn't you sleep a little longer? You're injured, yet you're letting me lean on you. Your body is already stiff and uncomfortable when you can't move. Now that you're carrying my weight, you should have woken me up," Jinwan said as she rushed to check the wound on his back. However, there was no more blood seeping out of his clothes. She sighed in relief. "I only suffered some superficial wounds on my back. It's not like I can't touch my whole body." Mo Jingshan was about to reach out to pick up the blanket that had fallen off her body. She was afraid that he would pull his mouth, so she pressed his hand down and turned to pick up the blanket herself. At this moment, the cabin was a little quiet. They didn't know if Nan Hung was really asleep or just taking a nap. Even if he heard the sound, he probably couldn't be bothered to care. Feng Ling hadn't slept, but she didn't speak either. She leaned against the wall of the cabin and didn't speak. No one knew what she was thinking. Jinwan lowered her voice. "Feng Ling, aren't you going to sleep? We're almost there. Mrs. Mo, you haven't had much rest these days. Pregnant people like to sleep and get tired easily. It's not good for you to stay with us like this. After we arrive in America, go to the hospital to have a good checkup." Previously, when they were in the Cambodia hospital, there were many injured people who needed urgent treatment. However, they didn't trust the hospital there, so they didn't let Jinwan go for a checkup. Now that they were about to land in America, it was better for her to go for a checkup. "I understand. I'll find some time to go take a look." Jinwan didn't want to cause trouble for them, nor did she want them to worry, so she directly agreed. However, when she heard that they were about to arrive, she subconsciously glanced outside. She could only see the American sky and the warm and dazzling setting sun, shining brightly. It had been many years since she came to America. Her expression was dazed for a moment before she suddenly asked, "Are we going to 11 Base? Or are we going to Officer Ince's place? Or we'll stop at the temporary airport in Los Angeles first. Our people will negotiate with Officer Ince's men. You and Mr. M.O. must be sent to the hospital immediately. His wound is deep, and the wound on his head isn't light either. He still needs a series of examinations and follow-up treatment. Your body also needs a further examination. You don't have to worry about anything else. Rest in the hospital. This is no longer Cambodia. There won't be so many scary things nearby. Just relax." As Feng Ling spoke, she glanced at the time again. "We'll probably land in half an hour. Mrs. M.O., if you feel any discomfort, let me know. I'll have them land as slowly as possible." "I'm fine. I can land normally." "But Los Angeles—" It was actually Los Angeles. That was right. If not Los Angeles, where else could she go? The M.O. family's company, Shine Group, was here. 11 Base was also in the suburbs of Los Angeles. She had also studied abroad in Los Angeles. To Jinwan, this place could be considered familiar. However, many years had truly passed. Including the 10 years in her previous life, she had crossed over even more years. There were many things that she could not remember clearly when she was young and ignorant. She suddenly felt a warmth in her hand. She turned to see Mo Jingshan's hand holding her, imprisoning her in his palm. As the plane was about to land, it slowly descended and passed by the Los Angeles River. The ancient bridge on First Street above the river was an important hub for entering and exiting Los Angeles. Jinwan looked down at the Los Angeles River. She suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's voice by her ear. "When you were studying in America, did you often come to the Los Angeles River?" She did not understand why he would suddenly ask this question. After thinking for a long time, she finally said, "My school was very far from here, so I rarely came to Los Angeles. However, there were a few times when I went out for gatherings with friends and classmates. At night, when I was bored, I would take a walk by the river. I did come here. At that time, I seemed to have gotten separated from them. In the middle of the night, the street lights by the river were broken. That night was especially dark." Speaking up to here, Jean Wan's eyes brightened. She seemed to have recalled something. "That's right, at that time, I also saved someone from the river. That person was covered in blood. I don't know how he was injured. If I hadn't been quick enough to catch him, he would have been washed downstream. Downstream is a waterfall. It's quite dangerous. Her voice had yet to land when she suddenly felt the man's gaze fixed on her. Jinwan choked. Her eyes met his, and a memory that she had hidden for a long time and did not place in her heart suddenly leaped up. The difference between mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and a first kiss. She was stunned for a while before she raised her head abruptly and met the man's smiling eyes in disbelief. Dash. Chapter 3:14. Before she could ask more questions, the plane had already landed. The cabin door was quickly opened. Feng Ling picked up her cell phone and called someone, but in an instant, many people had gathered outside the plane. Even after getting off the plane, Mo Jingshun did not let go of Jinwan's hand. Jinwan did not have a chance to ask him again, and the two of them were pushed by a group of people to the hospital. The wound on Mo Jingshun's back was not well treated in the Cambodia hospital. The doctor arranged a special passage for him, and he went for surgery as soon as he arrived. The surgery lasted from 6:30 p.m. to 10 o'clock p.m. American time. Because of the general anesthesia, Mo Jingshun did not wake up for the whole night. The police and the people from the base left after the surgery. After making sure that Mo Jingshun's wound was completely fine, Nanhung was persuaded by Jinwan to return to the base. Jinwan was supposed to stay in the ward to take care of him, but because he had just had an operation, Mo Jingshun needed to rest in the sterile ward tonight and would not be allowed in until tomorrow morning. She couldn't go in now, so she stood outside the ward and looked at the man's pale but still handsome face through the huge glass window. Her mind kept replaying the scene of Mo Jingshun looking at her before the plane landed. Was it him? The man covered in blood, the man she accidentally saved by the Los Angeles River. Was it Mo Jingshun? Feng Ling went out to buy some daily necessities Jinwan needed. When she came back, she saw Jinwan leaning against the glass window and went up to persuade her. She said that Mr. Mo had recovered a lot and needed to sleep for a day because of the anesthesia. He would be fine when he woke up tomorrow. She then took her to the OB/GYN department for a checkup. After the checkup, Jinwan's physical condition was good. There was no problem, but she had been emotionally unstable these days. In China's words, the fetus had been affected and was not very stable. She needed to rest in bed for a few days. The burns on her hands also needed to be properly treated, so she arranged a comfortable ward on another floor for Jinwan so that she could rest and accompany Mo Jingshun here. It wasn't easy for him to be able to lie down on a bed with peace of mind. There were no longer gunshots or explosions ringing in his ears, and there was no longer any threat to his life. However, Jinwan suddenly could not sleep. After tossing and turning for a long time, she picked up her phone and saw that Xia Tian had called her a day ago, as well as a few text messages. Where is he? Why aren't you picking up the phone? I'm not planning to come back yet. Cambodia doesn't even have any local specialties. How could it be worth your time? Come back quickly. There are hundreds of millions of orders waiting for you, Boss G. As soon as Jinwan returned to High City, she went to Cambodia. She only took the time to call Xia Tian and said that she was going to Cambodia for a vacation. Xia Tian thought that she was under too much pressure from studying in T-City and allowed her to come out and play happily. This so-called vacation was really an unforgettable experience. Jinwan smiled and called Xia Tian back. It was night in Los Angeles, but it was already morning in China. Xia Tian was in a meeting in the studio. After Jinwan briefly told her about her schedule, Xia Tian hurriedly said that she was in a meeting and directly hung up. She put down her phone and lay back on the bed. She picked up the ultrasound test report by the bedside and looked at the small, blurry image on it. Earlier, when she went for a checkup, the doctor said that the cute oval dot in the middle was what the baby looked like when it was still an embryo. After staring at it for a long time, Jinwan's gradually settled heart gradually calmed down, and she finally felt a little sleepy. However, she did not sleep for long. After sleeping for only a few hours, she suddenly woke up with a start. In the dream, Mo Jingshun was covered in blood. In that small wooden house, Dolly had a gun pointed at his forehead. Jinwan rushed in as though she had gone mad. The moment the gunshot rang out, she screamed hoarsely, but she could not make a single sound. She could only watch as blood splattered everywhere. She did not even see how Immerse had fallen after being shot. She only saw the ground covered in fresh blood. The warm blood seemed to have flowed to her feet. She was shocked to the point of breaking out in a cold sweat. She abruptly opened her eyes and sat up. Her nose was filled with the smell of disinfectant. This was a ward in a hospital in Los Angeles. It was white and quiet. There was no dolly, no gun, and no blood. Jean closed her eyes, raised her hand to rub her sweaty temples, and let out a long sigh of relief. Fortunately, it was just a dream. Jean lifted the quilt and got out of bed. She was wearing a brand new light blue hospital gown, which was very soft and comfortable. There were 2 delicate bags on the sofa in the ward, which were the clothes Phong Ling had bought for her before she left. As for the clothes she wore in Cambodia, of course, they were all thrown away, leaving no trace. Her dream was full of scenes of Immerse being injured. Jean really could not sleep. Although she had taken a shower before going to bed, she still habitually took a shower to relieve her stress. She went directly into the small bathroom in this luxurious single ward. When she came out of the bathroom, the sky outside the window was already white, and it was already 6 o'clock in the morning. Last night, the doctor said that she could only enter Immerse's ward after 6 o'clock. She took a look at the time, quickly dried her hair, combed it back with her fingers, and walked out. Early in the morning, Los Angeles, like High City, was invaded by the cold winter air. Even though the hospital corridor was air-conditioned at this time of day, the cold weather in the empty corridor made people feel cold to the bone. Jean got the doctor's permission, gently opened the door of the ward, and walked in with the help of the faint light in the ward. The curtains of this ward were closed, and it was very quiet. It was so quiet that she could hear the sound of a man's breathing. She walked to the bed. The light in the ward was not very bright. It was a relatively mild kind of cold light, but it was enough to clearly see the outline of the man's face, although it was half dark and not very clear. He was much paler and thinner than when he was in China. There was a light bruise on his chin, and the not-so-obvious bruise on his brow bone had not faded, but he was still incomparably handsome. In the bustling city of the United States by the Los Angeles River, the young man lay upright on the white bed, sleeping deeply. His face was calm, and his hands were placed on both sides of the quilt. There were also bloodstains on the back of his hands that had been treated with medicine. He was lying there, alive and well. Outside the ward window, the dawn of the morning was gradually rising. He lay here quietly, and the faint light fell on his face. Chapter 3:15. Immerse. Immerse. Muttering his name in her heart, Jean leaned down. Her soft lips kissed the bruise on his brows, his eyes, his high nose, and finally the man's light lips. However, she did not dare to kiss too hard. She only touched his lips and was about to get up. However, just as she was about to move away, the man's eyes, which had been quietly closed, slowly opened at this moment. When her lips were a few inches away from his light-colored thin lips moved slightly. Being kissed awake by you early in the morning, is this my reward for returning safely with all 4 limbs intact? The man's voice was low and hoarse, but each word struck her heart. Jean expression turned awkward, but she did not move away. She looked at the man's face so close to her and stared at his slightly drowsy eyes that were as dark as the deep sea. When did you wake up? Immerse looked at her and chuckled softly. I just woke up. It's only 6 o'clock now. The doctor said that the effects of the anesthesia would only subside after more than 10 hours. Why are you awake now? The little woman leaning against the side of the ward was much thinner than when she was in T-City. Her chin was much sharper, and there were obvious dark circles around her eyes, a sign that she did not sleep well. Even though the lights were not too bright, her expression could not be hidden. He raised his brows slightly, speaking hoarsely. Not to mention that it's already been 10 hours. Even if I had just been injected with anesthesia, I would still wake up if you kissed me like this. Jean smiled and was about to bring a chair over to sit by the bed to accompany him and take care of him. However, Just as she was about to take the chair, she suddenly heard Imo Jingshan say, "Don't sit. Come over, lie down." Jinwan heard him move slightly, as though he was about to give up half of the bed to her. She rushed to turn her head. "Don't move. Your wound has already been repeatedly injured several times. Now that the surgery is finally over, you have to rest quietly. You can't move for the next few days. The dark circles under your eyes are so big that you can't hide them. You came here at 6 o'clock. Do you think you're an immortal who doesn't need to sleep and rest?" The man's tone was tainted with some of his usual instigation, and his eyes signaled her to come over. Jinwan could only walk back to the bed and sit down. "I've slept. It's just that what I've seen and heard these past few days was too intense. I have nightmares, and I might need some time to recover." "Are you still talking about me? You didn't eat or drink for a few days, didn't you?" "I just slept a little less." "How am I God?" Imo Jingshan ignored her sophistry. He clearly understood the changes in Jinwan's heart. She needed time to recover from the shock, and he couldn't just stand there and watch her be scared. "It's still early. You need a rest too. You'll have nightmares if you sleep alone. Just sleep here, okay?" He laid flat and didn't move as she said. His voice was patient and gentle as he coaxed her to lie down with him. Although this was a single bed, it was slightly larger than the beds in ordinary hospitals. If Jinwan really lay down, there would be more than enough space. There was only him under the blanket. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the sky outside the window, and then glanced at Imo Jingshan. "Then promise you won't move. If something happens to your stitched back, because of me, I'll never come to your ward to accompany you again." The man seemed to chuckle. It was a light chuckle that came from his chest. He didn't expose her thoughts of wanting to lie down, but was too embarrassed to do so. He only answered, "In." Jinwan took a corner of the blanket, lifted it, and laid down on her side. Imo Jingshan's hand held hers, but Jinwan carefully slapped his hand away. "You said you won't move. Not even your hand." Imo Jingshan's voice was by her ears. "No, if your fingers move, your finger bones will move. If your finger bones move, your arm will move, then your shoulder, and then your back, head, and neck. You can't move at all," Jinwan said as she carefully lay down as if facing a formidable enemy. She didn't dare to touch him. She didn't expect that one day, when she slept by Imo Jingshan's side, she didn't even dare to touch him. "How weak do you think I am? How can my back be injured when I hold your hand?" When he said this, it was clearly a calm statement, but it sounded like a tease. It even seemed to contain the grievance of wanting to hold his wife, but not being able to. Jinwan lay flat and looked at the incandescent crystal lights on the ceiling. She sighed that not only was this hospital's medical standards excellent, but even this special ward was luxuriously decorated. If it weren't for the fact that the color was close to white, if it weren't for this white bed, it would be comparable to a 5-star hotel. In order not to let his wound be affected again, she simply turned over on the bed and faced him. "I'll watch you sleep like this, okay? If you watch me like this, how can I sleep?" The man said with a faint smile. "Jinwan, do I affect you like this? Then I'll go back to my own ward." He paused, slowly withdrew his hand that was about to hold her hand, and said meticulously, "You'd better lie here." His next words, "You're easily frightened when you have nightmares. I can comfort you whenever I'm here." Jinwan was silent for 2 seconds. "Did I often have nightmares before?" Imo Jingshan suddenly glanced at her. "Can your memory be any worse? A few months ago, you had a fever and begged me not to leave. You trembled all over and couldn't wake up from the nightmare. Don't you remember? It seemed that there was such a thing. It seems that I haven't had those nightmares for a long time." She leaned against his side, carefully pressed her face against his uninjured shoulder, and spoke in a low voice. Imo Jingshan gazed at her for 2 seconds. "Sleep. I'm here." "Okay." Even though he couldn't move, he still slowly put his hand on hers under the quilt. There are not only peaceful countries in this world. As long as you want to experience it, you can find a country more chaotic than Cambodia at any time. What you see and hear in a war-torn country will only be more tragic than those. Take some time to watch more news about the war, and you won't have nightmares about the death of these fugitives. That blood is what they deserve, and they lost their lives. Human life is indeed very fragile. Living in a peaceful world, you should cherish this peace. Okay, Jinwan knew that he was counseling her. She had heard that many people who left war-torn countries or some special disaster sites would go to a psychologist for counseling. So some people could never walk out of the bloody shadow of death. Her heart was not so fragile. Chapter 316. On the same bed, she turned her body slightly, but she was afraid that her movements would affect his wound. So even if she moved a little, she was very careful. It felt like the two of them had become one. His pain was her pain, and his wound was her wound. Just now, the hospital corridor was a little cold, but the ward was very warm. Jinwan was covered with a quilt. Her hair, which had just been showered, was still wet and pressed against her head. She pulled the quilt slightly, stretched out her arms, and carefully spread her hair out, no longer using it as a pillow. Through the dim light in the ward, Imo Jingshin saw the burns on the backs of her hands. The light blue hospital gown covered the wounds near her wrists, and the white gauze wrapped around the backs of her hands again and again. Nanhung knows a lot of friends and doctors who often go through fire and water. I asked him to get some medicine that can remove burn scars. You can apply it every day, he said in a low voice. He sounded calm, but there was a hint of heartache in his tone. Jinwan glanced at her hand and smiled. I'm fine. It's just that the top layer of skin was scalded and had a lot of blisters. Then I added some herbal ash to it, so it looks very serious. Yesterday, when the doctor here applied medicine on my wound, a layer of scalded skin had fallen off. The skin and flesh inside are not seriously scalded, but it may turn red for a while. I'll be fine after resting for a while. It was good enough that she could leave that place alive. If she didn't even have a scar, then what she had experienced might just be a fairy tale. Anyway, it was just a layer of skin that was scalded, and it would heal after a long time. It was not a deep scar. Imo Jingshen withdrew his gaze and held her hand under the quilt. Jinwan reminded him, just hold it gently. Don't use too much force. You'll hurt your arm and shoulder blades. I know, he said flatly. Obviously, he was a little upset that she had scalded herself. But it was true that he was not a delicate man, and she was not a delicate woman. Some traces left behind prove that they had indeed gone through fire and water together. Such traces were more meaningful than any wedding ring, gift, or souvenir. Imo Jingshin was obviously still under the effect of the anesthetic. He closed his eyes tiredly. Jinwan lay beside him and changed the topic, wanting him to rest peacefully. Why did you ask me if I often went to the Los Angeles River? Did I ask? You clearly asked me when the plane landed yesterday. That should be it. He even anesthetized his head during a surgery? You even forgot what you asked me yesterday. Did you forget a lot of things when you didn't have surgery? Jinwan was exasperated. So when I was 16, the night I was separated from my friend because the streetlights around us were broken, the person I fished up from the Los Angeles River was you? Imo Jingshan smiled. It seemed like she didn't lose her memory. She just didn't realize that she had unintentionally done a good deed and saved his life, so she didn't take it to heart. He closed his eyes and tightened his grip on her fingertips. I was more seriously injured than I am now. 11 Base's helicopter exploded a kilometer above the Los Angeles River, and I fell into the river. If it weren't for you, I would have been swept into the waterfall downstream, and there would be no Imo Jingshin in this world. It was really, she had just experienced all this in Cambodia, so she was not too surprised by what he said. She was just curious. She suddenly turned her head to look at the man's face so close to her. At that time, the streetlights were broken, and it was dark around the river. She only noticed that there seemed to be a lot of blood on his body. Perhaps because she had watched too many American sci-fi war movies, she was still young and had a little heroic feeling, so she wanted to save him. At that time, because she was young and bold, she didn't feel scared when she saw so much blood on his body, but she didn't see his face clearly. Later, when her separated friend called to urge her to go to the bridge to go back to school with him, she carefully helped him to a safe place on the shore, and before he woke up, she ran away in a hurry, but she didn't expect that person to be Imo Jingshin. For Jinwan, those memories were 10 years away, so it was really a long time ago to think about it. So, it was you who arranged the marriage between the Mo family and the G family? You didn't do it to repay me, did you? Jinwan's voice suddenly became bitter. Tut, please don't do it to repay me. She didn't like it. Mo Jingshun smiled. No, there are many ways to repay me. I don't have to sell myself. Jinwan, sell herself? Wasn't this equivalent to being openly despised by Mo Jingshun? The marriage was indeed grandfather's proposal, but the choice was mine. At first, because I knew it was you, I just paid more attention to you, but the real reason for the marriage had nothing to do with repayment. Then what's the reason? The man glanced at her. Are you sure you want me, a patient, to lie here and tell you so much? Just this one. I suddenly feel very sleepy. Can I just say this one? I can't fall asleep if you keep doing this. I'm really sleepy. In the past, it was fine if she didn't know about it, but now that she suddenly had so many connections, Jinwan's curiosity was piqued. However, he held back and didn't continue. Can't you make it short? The man didn't speak anymore, just gently held her fingers with his palm, stroked the gauze wrapped around the back of her hand, and closed his eyes as if he was really falling asleep. Jinwan wanted to ask more, but he had just had an operation last night and was woken up early in the morning by her. Her lips moved. Although she was unwilling, she closed her mouth and didn't disturb him anymore. She lay beside him and looked at the man. Finally, Mo Jingshun really fell asleep. She could see how much energy he had put into talking with her for so long. But she had to admit that the fear in her heart caused by the encounter a few days ago was really taken away. At this moment, except for the question marks and curiosity in her head, everything else seemed to have been squeezed out and the feeling of panic was gone. She stared at him for a while before she gradually felt sleepy. She slowly withdrew her hand from his palm and gently placed it on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. Beat after beat, it seemed to pass through the gauze in her palm and spread from her hand to her limbs and bones. It warmed her blood and nerves, allowing her to completely find the long-lost sense of security. Chapter 317. Los Angeles Hospital. At 8:00 in the morning, Nanheng and Feng Ling got out of the black SUV. Feng Ling went straight to Jinwan's ward without saying a word. Nanheng stood there, glanced at her back, raised his eyebrows, and smoked a cigarette at the door of the hospital before going in. However, when he was about to go to Mo Jingshun's ward, Feng Ling suddenly came over with a dark face. Nanheng glanced at her and heard the short-haired woman say, "Mrs. Mo is missing." Missing? Our men are guarding outside the hospital. How could she go out without a sound? I'll go look for her. Wait, don't rush, Nanheng said, and pushed the door open to enter Mo Jingshun's ward. However, as soon as he stepped in, he suddenly paused and took a step back. He half closed the door of the ward and turned to look at Feng Ling, who had yet to see clearly and had a strange look on her face. As if to make sure he didn't see wrong, Nanheng hesitated for 2 seconds before he pushed the door open and glanced at the bed. Sure enough, he saw Jinwan and Mo Jingshun lying in the same bed. Don't look for her. Nanheng sneered and signaled Feng Ling to look inside. Feng Ling glanced inside and her expression froze. She saw Jinwan lying on her side, carefully beside Mo Jingshun, her hand pressed against Mo Jingshun's chest through the quilt. Although Mo Jingshun was sleeping on his back, he looked particularly calm and warm. She probably came here as soon as the lockdown was lifted this morning. Nanheng glanced at the scene inside with a playful expression and was about to close the door and leave so as not to disturb the little couple's sleep. However, at this time, the man sleeping in the bed opened his eyes and glanced at the door. Jinwan didn't sleep very well. Hearing the conversation outside the door, she woke up and looked at the door almost at the same time as Mo Jingshun. When she met Feng Ling's and Nanheng's eyes, Jinwan was still a little sleepy and dazed. After 2 or 3 seconds, she sat up and almost forgot that there was an injured man beside her who couldn't move. The moment her hand pressed against Mo Jingshun's arm, she hurriedly withdrew it, looked at the door, and then at the man who was still very calm when he woke up. On the contrary, it was as if she had been caught red-handed in bed. She could have slept by herself, but she ran to her husband's ward and slept on the same bed as him. It was really awkward. Seeing that they were awake, Nan Hung smiled and pushed the door open. Feng Ling stood outside the door, hesitated, and then turned to walk out with the phone. "You came at 6?" Nan Hung took a look at Jean Wan. I didn't sleep well last night and woke up very early, so I came over at 6 o'clock. Jean Wan was about to get off the bed when her hand was held by the man on the bed. "Don't mind him. Go to sleep." Mo Jingshan's tone was mild and calm. Jean Wan, her legs, which were about to get off the bed, immediately shrank back. Mo Jingshan's bed was so warm. Of course, she couldn't bear to leave. However, although Nan Hung didn't say much when he approached the bed, the look he gave them clearly indicated that he was complaining about the two of them showing off their affection. Weighing between being shameless and being shameless, Jean Wan finally compromised and sat on his bed, not getting off. Jean Wan tugged the blanket closer to her body and then calmly looked at Nan Hung, who was about to reach for a glass of water with one hand and his phone with the other. His expression was confused and silent, and he was looking at the two of them with great displeasure. At this moment, Jean Wan felt deeply ashamed of herself for showing off their affection, so she snuggled under the quilt again, trying to make Nan Hung focus his attention on Mo Jingshan. "I just King came to visit the patient." Nan Hung picked up the glass of water and turned to fill it. After drinking half a glass with an ugly expression, he turned to see that Jean Wan had almost snuggled into Mo Jingshan's arms. Nan Hung, this time, it was not Jean Wan who wanted to lie down, but Mo Jingshan saw that 2 buttons of her hospital gown were accidentally undone when she slept, revealing a small part of her collarbone and skin, and signaled her to lie down and cover herself with the quilt with his eyes. When she finally lay down again, Jean Wan turned her face away, trying not to look at Nan Hang's expression, but Mo Jingshan held her hand very firmly and had no intention of letting go. Although their hands were both under the quilt, from the outside of the quilt, they could tell what was going on. Jean Wan raised her head and mouthed to him, "Let go of me first." Mo Jingshan glanced at her cheeks and bright eyes that were a little tight because of embarrassment and embarrassment. His lips curved beautifully, and he mouthed to her no. Jean Wan, because he was injured, she didn't dare to push or struggle away from his hand too hard. At this time, Nan Hung glanced out of the door of the ward. Seeing that Feng Ling was nowhere to be seen, his face darkened. Hearing the sound of the cup being slammed down, the two of them paused and looked at Nan Hung at the same time. Nan Hung resisted the urge to smash the cup on Mo Jingshan's face and said coldly, "You two, be careful. For the sake of the stability of the baby in her belly, you'd better be a vegetarian in the first 3 months of pregnancy, and try to restrain yourself after 3 months." "I just came to see him and took a nap," Jean Wan explained. "Well, I'll restrain myself," Mo Jingshan answered flatly. "Restrain?" Jean Wan was speechless. "Restrain? Restrain? He just took a nap. Why did it sound like he had done something like that just now?" She was still a pregnant woman. 10 minutes later, Feng Ling came in with several breakfasts. "Are you all awake?" The short-haired woman didn't even look at Nan Hung and took the breakfast in her hand to the bedside. "I think you haven't eaten anything yet. Mrs. Mo is now in the period of morning sickness, so I think the nutritious meals in the hospital are not very good. I went to a nearby Chinese restaurant to buy some Chinese breakfast, porridge, and fried dough sticks. Is that okay?" Before Jean Wan and Mo Jingshan spoke, Nan Hing had walked over. Yes. He had just reached out to take his share when Feng Ling picked it up, opened the plastic lid, and put it on the table by the bedside. "Mrs. Mo, you eat first." Nan Hung. After the breakfasts were distributed, Feng Ling saw Jean Wan come over in only the hospital gown, so she turned to go out and went back to her ward to fetch a coat for Jean Wan. Chapter 3:18. Nan Hing sat on a sofa not far from the bed, opened the plastic bowl, and ate a few mouthfuls of porridge. He did not answer Mo Jingshan's question, but thought of the picture of Jean Wan lying next to Mo Jingshan and then the picture of Feng Ling not even bothering to look at him. He felt that this bowl of porridge tasted like dog food in his mouth. In fact, Feng Ling is a very delicate person, but she is too good at hiding her emotions. As Jinwan fed Mo Jingshan breakfast, she said softly, "I've been in contact with her for so long. Although she's cold and distant most of the time, it's just that the protective layer around her is too thick." As she spoke, she blew gently on the bowl and then fed Mo Jingshan a mouthful of porridge, asking with concern, "Is it still hot?" Seeing Jinwan carefully fearing that he would be scalded, the smile on Mo Jingshan's lips grew clearer. Just now, the head of the bed had swayed a little, and he was now sitting on his stomach. Compared with Nanheng's cold face, his face was like a spring breeze. Nanheng really felt that he couldn't eat breakfast anymore. "I'm afraid you still don't know how he married you?" Nanheng said with a snort. Jinwan glanced at him and replied, "Do you mean that I saved him by the Los Angeles River a few years ago, or was something else?" Nanheng's cold brows moved, and he was a little surprised. "You know," Mo Jingshan said lightly, "there's no need to hide it." Nanheng looked at Jinwan and smiled. "Aren't you afraid that he married you to repay a debt of gratitude?" Jinwan. He said no. Mo Jingshan glanced at him coldly. "You can't control your own woman and can't bear to see me live a peaceful life. So you want to take the opportunity to sow discord?" Nanheng sneered, leaned back on the sofa like a master, and casually put his hands on the back of the sofa. Looking at the two people on the sickbed, one feeding and the other eating, he sneered and said, "What do you like about this once arrogant and domineering first miss? What's so cute that you, CEO Mo, are willing to tie the rest of your life to her?" This was a good question. Jinwan had wanted to ask that earlier. Mo Jingshan did not even think about it. He gently pressed down the spoon that Jinwan had just brought to his mouth, chuckling softly. A 16-year-old girl pouting her lips and blowing air at me without any rhyme or reason. As she blew, she said that this was her first kiss. Isn't that cute enough? Jinwan, can you not mention this matter again? From the perspective of her age, he was clearly a F** king retard. Nanheng rolled his eyes. Is this F** king cute? Mo Jingshan's elegant and deep brows rose slightly as he calmly said, "At High City's banquet, the way she hid in a corner to avoid the crowd in order to secretly drink a few glasses of wine was especially cute." When she heard that they were going to get married, she stopped her father's car on the street and argued that she wouldn't marry anyone she didn't love was especially cute. In order to escape from the wedding, she used a pair of scissors to poke 10 to 20 holes in her dress was especially cute. At the wedding, she purposely bent her fingers and declared that her fingers were crippled and couldn't wear the wedding ring was especially cute. After the wedding, she was so angry that she refused to throw the bouquet and hid backstage to vent her anger on the flower petals. Jinwan, she suddenly wanted to find a hole to hide in. Nanheng expressionlessly said, "I'm just asking casually." Mo Jingshan said seriously, "I can count a few more." Nanheng remained expressionless. "Save it for when your wife is 3 months pregnant. Go back to your bedroom and count them." Mo Jingshan looked at him with pity. "Didn't you want to hear it just now?" Nanheng remained expressionless. "I'm about to throw up from a few mouthfuls of porridge I just ate. Don't talk about it." "Thank you." Seeing that this topic had come to an end, Jinwan tested the temperature of the porridge in the bowl, scooped a spoonful, and brought it to Mo Jingshan's mouth. When a man looked at her, she pursed her lips and said with a hot face, "No wonder the Mo family flew a new wedding dress from France right after I destroyed it. So you saw it." Mo Jingshan immediately smiled. Mo Jingshan chuckled softly. "Are the flower petals delicious?" Jinwan sighed. She held the bowl in one hand and covered her face with the other, looking as if she couldn't bear the memory of her stupid behavior. After a long time, she put down her hand and tried to feed him the porridge calmly, lest she accidentally spilled it on him. "What else do you want to ask?" Mo Jingshan raised his lips and took a look at Nanheng. At the same time, he slowly raised his hand and pushed a strand of hair from Jinwan's cheek behind her ear. Jinwan hurriedly turned her head slightly to avoid his hand. "Don't move your hand." Mo Jingshan smiled and put down his hand. Nanheng waved his hand on the sofa, looking as if his heart had been devastated 10 times. I've been your brother for so many years, but you haven't even praised me once. Did this woman blow a breath of fairy air to you? Is she King beautiful when she drinks wine and eats petals? The corner of Ji Nwan's mouth twitched. She didn't care about fairy air, but her behavior was really seen by Mo Jingshan. She really wanted to disappear on the spot. She was going to lose face. Before she fled, Nanheng answered a phone call and left. Ji Nwan continued to feed him porridge, and Mo Jingshan continued to eat cooperatively. The ward was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Only the little woman's embarrassed expression didn't match the silence. Mo Jingshan took a look at her. Ji Nwan also took a look at him, then put down the bowl and cleared her throat. What he just said is true. Then, what on earth do you like about me? Mo Jingshan looked at the porridge that she had taken away and lowered his eyes to think. You can also understand that I'm bewitched by your beauty. Ji Nwan resisted the urge to roll her eyes. There are so many beautiful women out there. Even a small celebrity from the entertainment circle would have a certain level of beauty. Do you have to describe yourself as so shallow? The man smiled. Who told you to be so beautiful? Ji Nwan's heart was trembling from his smile. She couldn't talk to him anymore. She really couldn't talk to him anymore. She really couldn't flirt with him anymore. Ji Nwan's first reaction was to blush and her heart beat faster. She really couldn't stand this big boss who was said to be cold and unapproachable to be flirting with her seriously. After a few seconds, she calmed down a little. My reason tells me that what you've seen and heard about me must be more than that. When on earth did you find out that I was that person? At that time, the street lamp was broken, and I couldn't see clearly, let alone you who couldn't even open your eyes. Chapter 319. Ji Nwan, Mo Jingshan's smile faded. My life is yours. My body and mind are also yours. If you dare to abandon me now, won't your conscience hurt? Ji Nwan. She abruptly put down the bowl of porridge, pulled up the blanket on the bed, and covered his face. The man's body couldn't move, so she covered his face and head. After maintaining this position with the blanket for a full 5 seconds, she was the first to give in and tugged the blanket down with a pained expression. Ji Nwan's face was cold, and she said seriously, "Get well first. If you get hurt like this again in the future, I'll really abandon you." The man smiled and didn't provoke her anymore. He pointed to the porridge she put on the table. What? Continue to feed me. For the rest of the day, many of the little brothers of 11 Base came to the hospital to visit behind Nanheng and Fengling's back, but not everyone could enter Mo Jingshan's ward, not even the people of 11 Base. Ji Nwan received the call and went down to pick up those little brothers. When Nanheng suddenly came back and glared at them, the little brothers expressed their sympathy and prepared to leave dejectedly. Before leaving, one of them suddenly said with emotion, "Mr. Mo, I wish you good health and a happy married life, because Mrs. Mo is really a good person." Mo Jingshan, who sat quietly on the bed, was not affected by the liveliness here at all. His handsome face was calm, but he raised his eyebrows because of these words. The little brother pointed in the direction of the distant Cambodia. Previously, when we were in Cambodia, Mrs. Mo not only cooked for us, cleaned the house, but also washed our socks. We've been single for more than 20 years, and it was the first time a woman washed our socks. I couldn't bear to wear them. The moment Mo Jingshan heard this, Nanheng directly kicked his butt and chased them out. "Get out." They left, and the ward was quiet for a moment. Mo Jingshan turned his eyes to Ji Nwan. "Wash socks? Who ordered you to do it?" Without waiting for Ji Nwan to answer, he turned his eyes to Nanheng. "Don't look at me. I don't even believe that eldest Miss Ji can cook. How can I let her do this?" Nanheng felt that it was necessary to make those brats run 50 laps around the base after they returned. "She's too worried about your safety. She's afraid that she'll let her imagination run wild and find something to do." Ji Nwan coughed. "I'd do it myself. There's no need to mention this kind of thing. Just now, they were just joking. In fact, I didn't wash many pairs. I was just doing it out of courtesy. Otherwise, I'll feel bad if I eat, live, and be protected by them. Nan Hung snorted. Those brothers whose socks you've washed may face the fate of being target practice by a group of newbies from today onwards. You may feel even more apologetic. Jinwan, I don't think so. Nan Hung coldly raised his brows and pointed at Mo Jingshin on the bed with his chin. If you want them to be spared, you have to plead for them. Based on what he said, it wouldn't be good if she didn't plead on his behalf. Jinwan turned her eyes to the bed. Mo Jingshin indifferently glanced at Nan Hung. If you continue to use moral coercion on her, I'm afraid those brothers of yours will become targets for 2 years. Last night, Jinwan went to the gynecology department for a checkup too late, so there were some other items that she did not check. Jinwan was called to the consultation room by the doctor. In the ward, Nan Hung tossed his phone onto Mo Jingshin's bed. A private message appeared on the screen. The Su family received the news last night. The moment you entered the operating room, they came. With Officer Ents around, they weren't able to enter the hospital. However, after Su Shui was forcefully brought back to America, she must have been frightened by the way the people at the base punished her. It said that she's been locked up at home and her mental state isn't good. The Su family is still brooding over this matter and wants an explanation from you. Mo Jingshin coldly glanced at the message on the screen. Mental problems? Nan Hung coldly sneered. I think there's an 80% chance that she's really frightened. The psychiatrist visits the Su family every day. It's said that she often doesn't sleep for the entire night. Even the slightest movement would scare her into screaming. The doctor said that she's overly frightened. Mo Jingshin curved his lips slightly, coldly saying, since there's a mental problem, why would they want an explanation from me? I know a psychiatrist in Los Angeles. If they need it, send someone to send her to a mental hospital and treat her. How is this treating her? Mo Jingshin clearly wanted the Su family to lock Su Shui up at home. Now, he wanted to lock her up in a mental hospital. However, what Su Shui did to Jinwan in T-City, if not for Elder Su's face, Su Shui most likely would have lost her life. Elder Su already knows that you've returned to America, Nan Hung said. Are you going to pick up his call? Mo Jingshin's expression was indifferent. No. Late at night, Los Angeles was even colder than the north of China. The wind was biting. In the Su family in Los Angeles, the window of the bedroom on the upper floor of the villa was wide open. A young woman sat by the window, facing the cold wind, holding a glass of red wine in her hand. She took a sip and looked at the stars and moon in the sky. Her ears were filled with the conversation she occasionally heard when she went downstairs during the day. Mo Jingshin has returned to America. He's in the hospital, but he can't get in. The police and another group of people are guarding the hospital very strictly. We just want to take advantage of his rare return to America to make up for what Shui has done. Our Shui only went to T-City to seek justice for her cousin. She was indeed very absurd and offended Mrs. Mo. But no matter what happened, the doctor said that Shui's brain was severely damaged and her mental problems were even more serious. Shui is still so young. We can't really let them kill her. Elder Su, no matter what, Shui is your grandniece. She did this for Jilan. Now, that Mo Jingshin refuses to see her. You should at least step forward and speak for her. Since Mrs. Mo is unscathed, why would they destroy Shui? She is less than 20 years old, a few years younger than Jilan. The Su family has been friends with Shine Group for so many years and has a relationship with the base. Besides, Jilan used to be engaged to Mo Jingshin, so she can help him. I think it's better for you to solve this problem. Su Jilan gently swirled the red wine glass in her hand and slowly took a sip. Not long after, she became slightly tipsy. Her watery eyes slowly turned to the room and looked at the photo frame on the white shelf beside the bed. In the past 2 years, in order to prevent her from going to him, Grandpa had grounded her and forbade her from leaving Los Angeles or America. Chapter 320. She spent the whole day in Mo Jingshin's ward. At 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, a doctor came to give Mo Jingshin an anti-inflammatory injection, and Jinwan returned to her ward. Hospitals in the United States did not advocate injections, but Mo Jingshin's back and head wounds were deep, and he had just had an operation, so he needed continuous anti-inflammatory treatment to prevent infection. So he had to have 2 bottles of intravenous drips. However, the speed of intravenous drips was much slower than in China. It was said that this would reduce the possibility of the drug destroying the human body's resistance. After waiting for more than an hour, a bottle of medicine was not even 1/3 used up, so Jinwan didn't go back and fell asleep in the ward. When she woke up, it was already midnight, and she was awakened by the ding sound of a text message on her cell phone. She guessed that if she didn't sleep by Mo Jingshan's side, she would really have nightmares. Just now, she dreamed of blood again, but this time, it was not Mo Jingshan, but herself who was injured in the blood. Jinwan opened her eyes with a jerk and sat up. The ward was quiet and dark. She turned to see the screen of her cell phone on the bedside and immediately picked it up to check. Usually, only Xia Tian and Xiaoba liked to send her messages when they were not busy. She thought it was another call from the studio in High City, but the sender was not a number she was familiar with, but a string of 4 numbers. She received not a text message, but a photo. Jinwan hesitantly stared at the photos, stretched out her finger, and clicked on the photos to enlarge them. There were 3 photos. The first one was of the famous Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. Under a row of distinctive European-style buildings, a black limited edition Porsche was parked. The man opened the door and threw something back into the car, and the young woman stood beside him, waiting patiently and leaning her head gently on his back, making an inadvertent posture of snuggling up to the man. This scene was captured in the photo, and the moment she leaned close to him, the sweetness seemed to overflow from the photo. Although the man in the photo had his back to the car door and his expression could not be seen, Jinwan recognized that it was Mo Jingshan. The young woman's smile was bright and flamboyant. When leaning against his back, she seemed to know that someone was taking the photo and happily raised her hands into a V shape, smiling happily in the direction of the camera. The second picture was not taken. Looking at the slightly blurred pixels, it should be a picture taken from a surveillance camera. In the picture, Mo Jingshan had just stepped out of the elevator. From the scene, it seemed to be the elevator of a private apartment in Los Angeles. The opposite door was open, and a young woman came out in a bathrobe. Her hand was in the crook of the man's arm, and half of her body was leaning against his arm. Their posture looked very intimate. The man's face was not in the picture. He was wearing black trousers and a black shirt. It seemed like he had just returned from outside and returned to the home where he lived with his lover. The third photo was a photo of an engagement ceremony. It seemed like the staff of the hotel or somewhere had taken the photo from a distance. The floral decorations and dreamy scenes of the ceremony were all captured in the photo. At the end of the red carpet and flowers, the door of a Rolls-Royce limousine opened. On the red carpet, a tall and slender man in a black suit stood silently, without any expression on his face. A young woman got out of the car and walked towards a man. Although the man and woman in the photo were very small due to the background, the moment the woman lifted her skirt and the diamond engagement ring on her hand was captured in the photo. These 3 photos. If Jinwan understood correctly, the woman in the photo was the so-called former fiancée of Mo Jingshan. What was the purpose of the person who sent her these photos? Not to mention that Mo Jingshan had explained to her about the engagement in the United States a long time ago and had personally solved it. Jinwan had only expressed her dissatisfaction of being kept in the dark by Su Shui, but she had never distrusted Mo Jingshan. Besides, she had just experienced a life-and-death situation with Mo Jingshan. These photos were taken many years ago, and the person who sent them to her at this time was too obvious. But who on earth was the person who sent her these photos? Was it the woman in the photo, or some busybody? Even if she didn't think these photos were very revealing, many of the angles of the photos looked only one-sided intimacy, and Mo Jingshan's expression and face had never been facing the camera. But Jinwan had to admit that her heart was still a little moved, and her fingers resting on the phone screen felt slightly cold. Was it because they had returned to Los Angeles, and that woman was ready to show up? Jinwan was still looking at the photos when her cell phone suddenly rang. It was Mo Jingshan calling. She answered the phone. "Why don't you come over to sleep? Aren't you afraid of having nightmares?" The man's voice was warm and light, still a little low and hoarse. It sounded like he'd been asked to lie down by the doctor during the injection, and he must have been lying down for a long time. Jean-Wan slowly rubbed her hand on the phone, saying, "You just had an operation. I'd better not sleep at your place. I'll sleep there in a few days when your wound is better. Just now, when the doctor knew that I slept at your place in the morning, he specially said that your wound and the operation wound need some time to heal, and you can't make any violent movements. I'm just sleeping with you." "How can I make any violent movements?" The man chuckled. "Jean-Wan, the doctor just reminded me. He doesn't want me to disturb your rest." "Well, if you don't come over, I'll go over to accompany you now." No. You can't move or get out of bed now." Jean-Wan hurriedly lifted the quilt and got out of the bed. As she walked out, she said, "I'll go over now. Wait a minute. I'll put on my coat and come over." After getting a satisfactory answer, the man hung up the phone. Jean-Wan put down the phone and turned to pick up her coat. When she was about to leave the ward, she paused, lowered her head, opened the page of the photos just now, and deleted the 3 photos and messages from unknown sources. There was no need to keep these things. Jean-Wan didn't think she had a strong heart, but when she was in T-City, she had said that if the other party wanted to steal her man, she should do it openly and not play any tricks behind her back. So what if she was engaged? She was a legitimate Mrs. M.O. She had never thought that an ex-girlfriend was a terrible creature. Relatively speaking, the more the other party liked to use this method to make her presence known, the less she dared to confront her face-to-face, and the more she liked to play this kind of trick, the less likely the other party was to win. Chapter 321. In the dead of night, because M.O. Jingshin's ward was guarded by the people from 11 base, there was no need for too many medical staff to be on duty. So after avoiding the nurses in her ward, Jean-Wan quietly crept to M.O. Jingshin's ward. The people from 11 base would not stop her, although they felt a little strange that Jean-Wan would come here so late at night. They just nodded politely to her and let her go. When Jean-Wan pushed open the door of the ward and entered, she saw that the head of the man's bed had been shaken again. The man was wearing the same light blue hospital gown as her, and his clean hair was more fluffy and messy than usual because he often lay down, but it didn't spoil his handsome appearance. There was a silver 12-inch laptop on his quilt. At a glance, she knew that the M.O. Corporation in High City needed him to read some documents. "It's only been a day since the operation, and you're already working?" Jean-Wan gently closed the door, walked over, and slipped into the man's bed. At this time, Mo Jingshin had finished the injection, and there was only a trace of white transparent medical tape on the back of his hand, but it obviously didn't affect his work efficiency. Mo Jingshin took a look at her and was about to raise his hand to take Jean-Wan, who had climbed into the bed, into his arms, when Jean-Wan quickly pressed his hand down. "Don't hold me. Don't move your arms." The little woman was now very careful about every movement on his body. Mo Jingshin didn't comment, but smiled. "It's getting late. Sleep here tonight and don't go back. Okay? I just came here quietly to avoid the doctors and nurses. Now I won't go back even if you drive me back." Jean-Wan said, firmly covered the two of them with a quilt, lay beside him, and looked at the company documents on his computer. He had been in Cambodia for some time. Although there were vice presidents and many reliable managers and assistants in the company, there were still many final decisions that Mo Jingshin had to deal with personally. Judging from the number of unread emails, it could be seen that there were a lot of backlog of documents. "Do these documents need to be typed?" Jean-Wan asked. Mo Jingshin's hand stroked her hair. As soon as Jean-Wan finished speaking, he saw that he needed to type a reply. He had just retracted his hand to touch the computer when she suddenly sat up, took the computer away from the quilt in front of him, put her hands on the keyboard obediently, and turned to look at him seriously. "How should I reply? Let me help you." Seeing that she was so proactive, Mo Jingshin did not reject her good intentions. He signaled with his eyes for her to look at the other documents on the screen that had already been approved. "Write your consent here. At the same time, circle the items that need the attention of the company's departments. Let them arrange it themselves." As Jean-Wan listened, she quickly typed and highlighted the key points. Half an hour later, There were more than 10 pages of documents. Some required approval, while others required approval or rejection. Previously, when she was in the studio, she sometimes had to face the planning documents submitted by the subordinate departments. However, facing the various documents of such a big company like the MO Corporation, she really felt like an emperor reading the memorials to the throne. The ward was very quiet. Occasionally, a white light flashed on the computer screen when a new email was opened and refreshed. One of them approved the documents on the computer, and the other taught her how to deal with the planning and changes of the various departments. Although Jean-Wan had a deeper understanding of some decision-making than before she went to T-City, at this moment, such tacit understanding made her feel particularly hard-won. Usually, in High City, Mo Jingshin was so busy that he almost didn't have a holiday on weekends. Now, while he was injured in the hospital, he could still teach her how to deal with these matters step by step. The next morning, when Nan Hung entered the ward, he saw Jean-Wan sleeping on Mo Jingshin's bed again. What was more, Jean-Wan had obviously come last night and didn't go back to her own ward to sleep. As soon as Nan Hung arrived, Jean-Wan woke up and slipped out with an embarrassed expression, saying that she wanted to go back to her ward to wash up and brush her teeth. Seeing Jean-Wan run away, Nan Hung walked in with an expression as if he hadn't slept last night. He pulled a chair over and sat by the bedside, saying, "Elder Su called me last night, and Su Shui's parents went straight to their house to make a scene, asking Elder Su to plead for their daughter. Now that you've turned off your cell phone and are living in the hospital leisurely, accompanying your wife every day, kissing, hugging, and playing romantic games. Elder Su knows about my relationship with you, so he directly came to me. Last night, he called me several times in the middle of the night, causing me to not sleep well last night. By the way, Su Shui's parents are influential figures in the Swan Group. Now they're almost breaking their leg for their daughter, and Elder Su often avoids them. Their dispute has been going on for a long time. Now that you've returned to the United States, it's clear that things have escalated to a certain point. If they don't see you in person, they may directly come to the hospital to make a scene." Nan Hung looked thoughtfully at Mo Jingshun, who was expressionless, leaned back in the chair, picked up an apple on the table next to him, and took a bite. "I don't think the Su family will give up so easily. Su Shui's parents want to make a scene purely to protect their daughter. But Elder Su, who has never stirred up trouble, now wants to take this matter on his head. Clearly, he has ulterior motives," Mo Jingshun said mildly. Nan Hung pondered for a moment. "Indeed, Elder Su is here for you. You've been suppressing him for so long, and not long ago, you made a hard plan to restrict the Su family. In the end, Elder Su hasn't even seen your face. An old man who's been all-powerful in the American-Chinese business world for many years definitely won't be convinced. Besides, he still has a precious granddaughter who can't forget about you." "All-powerful?" Mo Jingshun smiled. "For 100 years, the Chinese business circle in the United States has been either black or white. It's not like you don't know which side is behind the Su family's business. In this kind of place, the Su family isn't the only one who can stand firm. Elder Su should be able to tell that your tolerance towards them has been declining. Recently, he has been very close to your father. Back then, wasn't it your father, Chairman M.O., who single-handedly arranged the marriage between you and his precious granddaughter? I think he most likely knows that he can't beat you, so he plans to borrow your father's east wind to stabilize himself." Nan Hung smiled faintly. "Based on this old fox's usual tricks, he should know that your weakness is Jean-Wan. I'm afraid he has already begun to investigate Jean-Wan. Aren't you afraid that if she continues to stay in the United States, she will be swallowed by the Su family one day when you're not careful?" Chapter 322. I don't know if they can swallow it or not, but the Su family will certainly not let the person who occupies the position of Mrs. Mo stay in peace. After all, it's the position that Su Zhilan dreams of. Nan Hung said with a faint smile, "When we were in China, Phone Ling's cell phone had been installed with an information software connected to Jean-Wan's cell phone. Once there are unknown or strange calls and messages, Phone Ling can see them. Last night, Jean Wan received a few photos, but she was very calm and deleted them. If I guess right, she hasn't mentioned it to you until now. What photos? Mo Jingshin put the computer aside and cast his eyes on him. When Su Jilan was with you, her assistant liked to take photos of you. These photos were taken at an angle that could easily be misunderstood. It's not easy to find a few very confusing photos from so many photos. It's even more difficult for Jean Wan to remain calm and not even ask about it. Mo Jingshin's cold eyes swept over him, making Nan Hung feel a chill on his back. Obviously, he was not in the mood to keep him guessing. Photos, Mo Jingshin said in an unkind tone. Hearing this, Nan Hung knew that Mo Jingshin was used to compromise on Jean Wan, so he didn't beat around the bush and threw the cell phone to him. These 3 photos. If I remember correctly, when Su Jilan ran away from home because of a conflict with her grandfather, she lived alone in the apartment. At night, she called you and said that the water heater at home was broken and asked you to help her check it. That night, she was going to leave you there, but you came back in less than half an hour. I've been curious about this for many years, but I haven't found a chance to ask you. Did you touch her at all that night, or too fast? Nan Hung said this with a smile in his eyes, obviously teasing. Mo Jingshin looked at the photos on the cell phone and coldly spat out 2 words, I didn't touch her. For her to be able to keep a screenshot of you entering her apartment's hallway till now, it shows that her heart hasn't cooled even now. If Jean Wan were to see these 3 photos, her heart would probably be experiencing a magnitude 10 earthquake. Did she really not say anything when she came to sleep at your place last night? Mo Jingshin thought of the scene last night when Jean Wan helped him deal with the documents here until late at night, and his eyes darkened. He turned off the cell phone and glanced at the door that Jean Wan had just closed when she walked out. Jean Wan did not return to Mo Jingshin's ward. After washing up, she called Feng Ling to go to the commercial street opposite the hospital to relax. Although the doctor had told Jean Wan to rest in the hospital, she was allowed to simply go shopping. After all, Jean Wan was not injured, and it was good for her body and the child to go out for a walk occasionally. Besides, Feng Ling had seen the photos Jean Wan received last night. When Jean Wan called her, she immediately came to take her out of the hospital. It had been a long time since he had been to the United States. Other than some small shops and small buildings, the streets of Los Angeles had not changed much. It was already a mature international city, unlike China, which was still fully developing and had many investment and business opportunities. The hospital they were staying in was a large, professional, and well-equipped private hospital in Los Angeles. The hospital was located near downtown Los Angeles, very close to the busiest commercial street here. This time, their return to the United States was very sudden, and they didn't bring many clothes back. Jean Wan bought a thick, wet white cashmere coat for herself and a black cashmere coat for Mo Jingshin in accordance with the same cold season in Los Angeles and High City. One black and one white. She made them look like a couple. She also bought some other clothes that she needed to wear frequently. After they were tired, they passed by a milk tea shop. She couldn't drink anything now, let alone touch milk tea or coffee. Seeing that there was warm milk in the shop, the 2 of them took their bags and sat down in the shop. Feng Ling accompanied Jean Wan all the way and didn't urge her to go back to the hospital early. If she wanted to come in and sit for a while, she would accompany her. If she wanted to drink milk, she would buy it for her. In short, if Jean Wan could digest those hidden unhappy emotions in such a calm way, she would accompany her more, in case she had nowhere to vent and kept calm. Jean Wan sat by the window in the milk tea shop. Feng Ling helped Jean Wan line up to buy milk, and then went to the other side to buy a small cake. Jean Wan sat at the table, drinking milk and looking at her cell phone. It didn't take long before she felt as if someone had been staring at her. She turned to look out, only to see a young woman in a blue custom-made coat standing by the roadside near the overpass. Her eyes fell accurately in Jean Wan's direction through the window. The moment their eyes met, Jean Wan recognized the woman in the blue coat. It was the woman in the photo last night. She came so quickly? Jean Wan raised her eyebrows. Growing up, she had met all kinds of socialites and daughters in the circle, as well as Ji Min Gran, who had always been scheming against her. She had been used to so many troublemaking and restless women. She had thought that a woman who had a past with Mo Jingxin would at least be someone who could stay calm. At least, her character and means should be several levels higher. However, to her surprise, the other party didn't seem to have much patience. The woman in the blue coat saw that Jin Wan had looked this way and that Feng Ling, who usually accompanied her, was not sitting opposite her. After a moment of silence, she came over, walked into the milk tea shop, opened the door, and went straight in this direction. At such a close distance, their eyes met. Jin Wan slowly drank the hot milk in the cup. There was a little sugar in the milk, which was sweet but not greasy. It was so delicious that she didn't want to put down the cup. She glanced indifferently at the woman in the blue coat. The woman was about to come over when she suddenly turned to look at Feng Ling, who was lining up in the suite area. After a moment of hesitation, her eyes fell on Jin Wan again, saying, "Miss G, do you want to go to the bathroom with me?" Jin Wan looked at her. This beauty in blue did not just want to go to the bathroom. Her face was full of, "I want to talk to you about a day of fighting." She was not stupid. How could she accompany a woman who was a threat to her to avoid Feng Ling's sight? Besides, she was drinking here. Why should she accompany her to the bathroom? Chapter 323. Su Zhilan had heard from Su Shui that Jin Wan was not someone who could be easily controlled. Seeing that Jin Wan wouldn't stand on the passive side at all, Su Zhilan pondered for a moment and then walked over. Jin Wan raised her eyes and said lightly, "Jin Wan." Because of her initiative, the other party smiled politely at her. Su Zhilan. What a friendly way to start a self-introduction. Was her surname also Su? Jin Wan asked calmly, "Is Su Shui yours?" Cousin. Su Zhilan's appearance and temperament were both beautiful and aggressive. She was about 1.66 meters tall and wore high heels. Her oval face had a small pointed chin, which made her look even more beautiful. She was wearing a white t-shirt, trousers, and a blue coat. Her hair was permed into a casual and generous light wavy style, which fell behind her shoulders. Standing here, she had a proud and superior temperament and was unrestrained in her beauty. At first glance, one could tell that she was a very flamboyant person. Jin Wan nodded in understanding and slowly uttered a word, "Sit." Then she picked up the glass of milk and took another sip. "There's no need to sit. If it's convenient for you, Miss G, let's talk somewhere else." Su Zhilan glanced at Jin Wan drinking milk. She had never heard that Jin Wan liked to drink milk, and this was a milk tea shop. It was strange that she would choose pure milk here, but she would never have thought that Jin Wan was pregnant. "No matter where I go, Feng Ling will still follow me." Jin Wan put down the glass and said coldly and slowly, "If you mind Feng Ling's existence very much, I can ask her to rest in another seat and wait for me." Su Zhilan looked at Jin Wan calmly for a while, thought about it, and sat down. Jin Wan was very beautiful, which was a well-known fact, but Su Zhilan, whom she met for the first time, was also very beautiful. The two women had completely different aesthetics. Sitting here at the same time, they had become a beautiful scenery in this milk tea shop. Many men would take a few glances at them when they passed by. "Miss G, you don't seem surprised to see me. It seems that you know why I'm here." Su Zhilan didn't keep her guessing and said with a smile, "You're not what I thought." "Really? In what way?" Jin Wan put down her cell phone, raised her eyes, and met Su Zhilan's judgmental eyes. There seemed to be a smile in Jin Wan's eyes, but the smile was very shallow. Su Zhilan a lot. Temperament, character, and attitude when you see me, and so on. Jin Wan's and Wan Zhilan. Mississippi. Since Miss Su said that I'm different from what you imagined, it seems like you've specially investigated me and understood me. But I'm sorry, before yesterday, I didn't have any general impression of you because no one had mentioned you to me. Not to mention your voice and appearance. I didn't even know about your existence. Zhilan, and Su Zhilan Su's Lan's words, Su Zhilan Lan said. And smile Su Zhilan immediately. Su Zhilan's ex-girlfriend, who was supposed to be a thorn in Su Zhilan's heart, was completely ignored. No one would feel good. After all, she was completely ignored, and she was clearly told that she was the one being ignored. Really? It seems that the people around Jingshan have done a good job of protecting and respecting me. Su Zhilan smiled, called the waiter, ordered a glass of water, and took a sip. Jinwan's cell phone rang. It was a text message. She glanced at it, then half closed her eyes and chuckled. Oh, since you're the one being protected, why did you send me that kind of photo last night? Follow me all the way from the hospital to here. And now you're sitting in front of me, breaking the protection circle they built for you? Don't you feel disappointed? Since you've come to Los Angeles, I have to come to see you. Su Zhilan was calm and full of smiles in the face of Jinwan's doubts. Jinwan said casually, Do you know what Su Shui did to me when she was in China? Su Shui looked at her. I came here today to apologize to you on her behalf. Shui and I grew up together. She's my closest cousin in the Su family. She's less than 20 years old this year, so she was a little impulsive. I hope you don't mind, Miss G, but as far as I know, you haven't really been hurt. Let's forget about this matter, shall we? Jinwan glanced at her coldly. It's not up to me whether we can turn a blind eye to Su Shui's matter or not, but can you explain to me what happened to the wedding dress doll that was sent from America, Miss Su? After a pause, the smile in Su Zhilan's eyes faded. I thought Miss G was more suitable to communicate in a euphemistic way. At least, you still wanted to save some face and not make it too ugly, but obviously, I overestimated you. Jinwan casually leaned against the back of the chair, smiling leisurely. Her facial features were like a work of art created by the hands of God. Her skin was white, her lips were red, and her eyes were beautiful. When she came out of the hospital, for convenience's sake, she tied her seaweed-like long hair into a simple ponytail and let it hang behind her head, which made her look more energetic. The ends of her hair hung behind her back, and only 2 strands of hair by her cheeks fell to her shoulders due to the loose hair band, which made Jinwan's beauty, which was not particularly aggressive, appear much softer. But her eyes were not soft, her tone and her attitude were not soft either. She glanced lazily at the beauty sitting opposite her and said lazily and coldly, Don't make it sound so dignified. It was you who sent that kind of express delivery. I'm holding you responsible. Miss Su, don't think that everyone has the mood and energy to sit here and play harem tricks with you. Since you're here, just say what you want to say. Don't keep me guessing. Su Zhilan sat opposite her, looked at her for a moment, and took out a red velvet box from her bag. This is the ring we got engaged to Jingshan 3 years ago. Miss G, it seems that you haven't worn a wedding ring on your ring finger since you got married. Do you not like the style of the wedding ring? Why don't you take a look at this? Anyway, I don't need it now. If you like it, I'll give it to you. With that, she opened the red velvet box, and inside was a 5-carat heart-shaped diamond ring. Jinwan glanced at the thing in the box. It was big, shiny, and beautiful. Chapter 3:24. But an engagement ring? It stood to reason that Su Zhilan, who came from a rich family like Jinwan, should not be particularly interested in such extravagant and pompous things. But it was clear that Su Zhilan was different from her in this respect. Did this Miss Su deliberately pretend to be a little white rabbit in front of her to lower Jinwan's guard? Or was she so naive? She used this kind of thing to disgust people. Jinwan had to admit that her mood, which had not fluctuated for a long time, was indeed disgusted. Speaking of the wedding ring, Jinwan was in the wrong. When she and Mo Jingshan got married, she refused to wear it at the wedding and tried to avoid it. But in the end, Mo Jingshan put on her. But that night, she threw the ring into the drawer of the bedside table in her bedroom. A few months ago, when she was in the Yew Garden, she deliberately went to look for it, but couldn't find it. She guessed that Ji Minggran might have taken her wedding ring away when she was living in the Yew Garden. At that time, Jinwan and Mo Jingshan did not choose that ring together. Instead, grandfather Mo had ordered someone to have it custom-made abroad. The design was very extravagant and flashy, even more so than the one in front of her. Such a large diamond was indeed not the style she liked. With Mo Jingshan's quiet and low-key personality, he would definitely not like this type, so she did not deliberately look for it again. But now Su Jilan discussed her with the reason that she hadn't worn a wedding ring. Jinwan didn't speak for a while. Feng Ling had seen what was going on here after buying the cake. When she saw Su Jilan, she planned to come over immediately, but when she saw the two of them sitting here and seemed to be chatting calmly, she hesitated and decided not to be nosy, so she waited for a while. However, he only waited for a few minutes before he walked back. Mrs. Zemo, the cheesecake was placed in front of Jinwan, and at the same time, she pushed the red velvet box away a little, blocking Jinwan's attention from the ring. Feng Ling said, "Let's go back after eating this cake. It's getting late. Mr. Mo will be worried about you." Feng Ling, long time no see. Su Jilan, who was ignored by Feng Ling, looked at her with a smile. Feng Ling finally turned to look at her and said coldly, "Miss Su." Su Jilan looked at her with a smile, thought for a while, and quietly closed the red velvet box on the table, saying with a smile, "I heard you returned to Los Angeles, but you have been in the hospital these days. Who on earth is sick? I heard from my grandfather and uncle that the hospital is heavily guarded and can't be entered. Is there anyone who is seriously ill?" "Sorry, I'm just Mrs. Mo's bodyguard. I don't know anything else," Feng Ling answered coldly. Su Jilan paused and smiled knowingly. "With your ability, Feng Ling, you're actually willing to be a bodyguard. Is it because Nanheng doesn't take you seriously? Or is it Jingshan's idea?" Su Li Jilan Su can to say that Su and Su to say said, "Angelus a Su. Miss Su, you worry too much. The relationship between me and Mrs. Mo is not just that of an employer and a bodyguard. We are friends. Although it is my duty to protect her, it is more of my own free will." Su Qing Sang smiled coldly and said, "Miss Su, you're right." Su Jilan couldn't help but feel embarrassed when she saw Su Li Jilan's attitude. She pursed her lips and suddenly looked at Jinwan. Feng Ling has always been colder and harder than a man. It's rare that you can get used to her. In the past, when I first came into contact with her, I also... Mrs. Mo, shall we go back? Feng Ling interrupted her and looked at Jinwan. Jinwan knew that Feng Ling was not a meddlesome person. She wouldn't intervene in the matter of the legal wife and the ex-girlfriend sitting together, but now Feng Ling obviously didn't want Jinwan and Su Jilan to have more contact. "Okay." Jinwan pushed the uneaten cake in front of her to Su Jilan and smiled at her. "Miss Su, you followed me for so long. Don't come here in vain. There were so many people waiting in line just now. This cake must taste good, and Feng Ling specially waited in line for so long to buy it. Eat it. We'll go." Seeing that Jinwan stood up and was about to leave, Su Jilan was about to say something, but then she hesitated and said calmly, "We haven't talked much, and it's not dark yet. Why are you in such a hurry, Miss Ji?" Jinwan said, "You send me the photos and show me the ring. Miss Su, no matter how many trump cards you have in your hands, you have to give others some time to prepare. Otherwise, it will seem too deliberate, won't it?" Su Jilan didn't speak anymore, just smiled and looked at Jinwan again. However, Feng Ling quickly stood between the two of them, blocking their sight and warning Jinwan to go back with her immediately. Jinwan turned and walked out. When she walked to the door of the hospital, Feng Ling suddenly said, "What did she say to you just now? An ex-girlfriend is an existence that makes people unhappy. There's no need to say anything at all. Just sitting in front of me with a confident expression is enough to disgust me. Is there a need to say anything?" Jinwan said lightly, but she was very generous and said that she would give me her engagement ring. I wondered if she was really so naive. Although I can see that she is a little impulsive, I don't think she is so simple. Feng Ling said seriously, "She is indeed not simple. Don't be fooled by her appearance." Jinwan paused and glanced at her. "You mean she's clearly a big wolf, but she pretends to be an innocent little rabbit in front of me?" Feng Ling looked at her. "Just be careful. She's not easy to deal with. The Su family is also powerful, and the force behind them is not simple." Jinwan raised her eyebrows and smiled. "Huh, so Su Jilan must have come to probe her out today." Chapter 325. Jinwan was not surprised at all. "I can see that. A person who deliberately dismembered such a cute and beautiful wedding doll inserted blades, and mailed it from America to High City, I don't believe that she isn't a sinister person. Then why did you sit with her and chat with her? You clearly knew that she came with a purpose. Jinwan glanced at her and sneered. Who said that only she came to test me? And I couldn't test her. Since she came prepared, how could I not be on guard? Then what did you find out? Well, nothing. I just felt that the diamond ring was really big. When Jinwan returned, the doctor was about to change Imo Jingshan's dressing. Imo Jingshan sat on the bed and took off his clothes. Jinwan entered the door and hesitated, considering whether to enter now or after the doctor left. The doctor was standing by the bed, saying, "Mr. Imo, please turn around." The man did not move and did not give any response, as though he did not hear her. The doctor repeated, "Mr. Imo, your wound needs to be treated externally every day. Please turn around." He still did not move. The doctor paused and suddenly turned to look at Jinwan, who was standing by the door. Knowing that she was Mr. Mo's wife, he was about to ask her for help when Jinwan came over. Jinwan came to the bed and reached out to put Imo Jingshan's clothes on him, covering only his shoulders and front, revealing his scarred back. Then she gently pushed him to turn around and slowly smoothed the clothes over his shoulders to avoid touching the wound on his back. Imo Jingshan let her do as she pleased, only glancing at the woman's calm face. The doctor glanced at them and was about to come over to apply the medicine, but Imo Jingshan quickly turned away. Seeing his movements, Jinwan immediately frowned. "What are you doing?" The man turned to look at her and then reached out to pull her, completely ignoring the wound on his back. The moment he raised his arm, Jinwan watched as a drop of blood oozed out from the largest suture on his back. Imo Jingshan. Jinwan's brows furrowed even more. She was about to say something when the man held her waist and pulled her onto his lap. She was forced to sit down. Just now, he had stretched his wound because he had raised his arm. Now his arm was around her waist, and she didn't dare to struggle too much. However, the man's other hand was also holding her tightly in his arms, so she couldn't move. He pressed his lips against her temple, and his voice was low and faint. "I'll apply the medicine later. You go out first." The words were addressed to the doctor. "You apply the medicine first. What can't you say later?" Jinwan still wanted to struggle. She couldn't let his wound have any more problems or delays, but she didn't dare to struggle too much. After moving a few times, she was firmly pressed into his arms. She turned her eyes and glared at him. "Imo Jingshan, you really don't take your health seriously, do you? What if your wound is torn and infected again and again? It sounds like a minor wound, but if you don't deal with it properly, it may cause a full-body infection. If something happens, do you want to stay in a hospital for the rest of your life? Or do you want me to stay with you in the hospital for the rest of your life?" He withdrew his hand from her body. Jinwan was about to get up, but as if regretting, he suddenly raised his hand and held her back. Then the man kissed her on the cheek, and her ears were full of his low chuckle. "Why are you so angry?" Jinwan wanted to roll her eyes. She didn't even see the engagement ring that Su Zhilan took out, and now she was even more annoyed to see the blood oozing out of his wound. "Apply the medicine first. I'll sit next to you. I won't leave or disturb the doctor." Seeing his pale face, Jinwan knew that he deliberately wanted her to stay here, but she couldn't bring herself to go back to her ward, so she finally compromised. The stalemate lasted for less than a minute. The man finally let go of her. She withdrew her gaze, got up, sat down with a straight face, and said to the doctor, "Apply the medicine." The doctor nodded and secretly gave Jinwan a thumbs up. Mr. Imo was not a simple person. Doctors like them didn't dare to speak loudly, and if Mr. Imo didn't cooperate, they didn't dare to force him to apply the medicine. However, with just a few words from Mrs. Imo, he obediently turned around and cooperated. While applying the medicine, Jinwan finally had a chance to see the wounds on his back clearly. Although they were sutured well, the wound was too deep, and the wound in the middle of the spine was also deep and large. Although the surgical sutures nowadays were similar to cosmetic needles, and if one was willing to spend money, he probably wouldn't leave any scars, but it would take at least several years for the scars to disappear. She seemed to see the scene when he was hit hard on the back of the hand and the back of the head by the sharp gun butts of the two men. He had been wearing a shirt, and when the doctor treated him, she didn't have the courage to look at the wounds on his back. Now that she saw them, she felt as if a large piece of blood had been dug out of her heart in an instant. She was really distressed. Mo Jingshin was sitting facing Jinwan, and he could see the distress that flashed across her eyes and her slightly red eyes. The softness in the woman's eyes made the man's heart skip a beat. He reached out and held her in his arms. His thin lips kissed her cheek, not too deep or too shallow, and his breath covered more of her skin. Because there was a doctor here, Jinwan turned her head away shyly, but the man's kiss fell directly on her ear, which was her sensitive spot. She shivered and quietly raised her hand to push him in his arms. However, he didn't care that there was a third person present. He kissed her harder and harder, and finally, he held her chin and kissed her hard on the lips. The doctor looked at them as he applied the medicine. He didn't dare to look at them and tried to keep his eyes on Mo Jingshin's back. After hurriedly changing the medicine, he picked up the gauze and wrapped it up and then left the ward without a word, not daring to disturb him. Kissed by the man, Jinwan gave up struggling. The door of the ward opened and closed. She knew that the doctor had left. Although she was a little embarrassed, it was too late for her to be embarrassed now. She ignored the man's kiss and just asked with a frown, "Why didn't you apply the medicine just now?" "Because I saw you came back and wanted you to stay." His low, husky voice was against her lips. Chapter 326. He lowered his eyes to look at her and lightly curved his lips. "You didn't suddenly go shopping because you were angry?" Jinwan's heart ached. She really didn't want her mood to be affected by certain someone's presence here. She said, "You're perfectly fine in the hospital. Why would I be angry?" The man gazed at her deeply. "I thought you were soaked in jealousy because of those photos taken at a deliberate angle." She was surprised. "How do you even know what kind of photos I've received on my phone?" Phoneling's phone is installed with an app that connects to your phone. She won't receive normal messages, but she can see messages from strange numbers or unknown numbers. Mo Jingshin did not hide it. "No wonder. Don't you have anything to ask me?" The man looked into her eyes, his handsome face unruffled. "You just said that it's just a few photos taken at a deliberate angle. What else can I ask?" Jinwan turned to pick up the fruit basket that someone had sent over. She took out a fruit knife to cut the fruit and did not say anything more. After she finished cutting the fruit, she turned back and saw that the man was looking at her. His gaze was indifferent, and she could not see his emotions. Jinwan did not understand. She cut the fruit into small pieces and put them on the plate. She then used a plastic fruit fork to fork and handed it to him. "Here, have some fruit." The man did not take it, nor did he move. He quietly watched her with his dark eyes. "Are you sure you don't want to ask me anything?" Jinwan picked up a piece of fruit and put it into her mouth with a disapproving expression. "You're a man, not a teenager. It's inevitable that you'll have some past. What else can I ask other than forcing myself to accept it and not pursue it and not letting my imagination run wild? Should I ask you how you felt when you were engaged for the first time? Or when you were dating Miss Sue, did you kiss, hug, or sleep with her?" In fact, Jinwan should not have said the latter half of her words. She was just following her heart. Originally, she just wanted to show that she was free and easy. After saying it, she regretted it immediately. However, she could not take back her words. After finishing her words, she avoided the man's gaze and turned to the table with the fruit platter. "You're quite magnanimous." Mo Jingshin's indifferent and unperturbed tone caused one to feel strangely cold. Jinwan did not know why Mo Jingshin suddenly gave her a cold look. She hadn't even had time to adjust her mood, let alone appease Boss Missouri. She put another piece of fruit into her mouth and chewed hard. She still felt angry and her chest was stuffy. She said she didn't mind. Her words were also very beautiful, but she couldn't completely ignore it. Oh, women. She thought she'd better go back to her ward to be alone and figure out what happened to Sujalon. She put down the fruit plate and the fruit knife and turned to leave. In the end, because she moved too quickly, the fruit knife fell to the ground. She heard it, but didn't turn around. Anyway, she didn't use it now. If it fell, then so be it. Someone else would come in and pick it up. I'll go back to the ward first. I'll come back later. Jinwan did not look at Mo Jingshin and was about to walk out. You can go. Mo Jingshin's tone was indifferent. The gentleness and passion from when he hugged and kissed her earlier seemed to have faded away. He had once again become the cold and noble CEO Mo that others spoke of. However, he was the more distant and cold CEO Mo that Jinwan rarely interacted with. She paused and walked to the door of the ward. As soon as her hand touched the doorknob, she suddenly heard something. She turned to see Mo Jingshin stand up by the bed. He got up very slowly and with some difficulty, and his pale face was still cold. Seeing him get up to pick up the fruit knife, she frowned and hurriedly walked back to pick it up and put it on the table. The man's movements paused, and he raised his eyes to look at her. I was in a bad mood just now. I didn't want to disturb you. Have a good rest in bed. Don't get out of bed and walk around, Jinwan said, and turn around. If you're in a bad mood, ask what you want to ask. Why don't you keep your words in your heart? The man's eyes were deep. He looked at her face and forced her to stop. You're in a bad mood? It's not that I'm in a bad mood. I just don't want to be too stubborn and want to think clearly. Mo Jingshin retreated to the bedside and slowly sat down. Clearly, the action of sitting down would affect the injury on his back. It was slightly strenuous. His brows furrowed slightly before he turned to look at her. What are you trying to do? Tell me. Let me hear it. Right now, the most important thing is your health. There's no need to worry too much. Jinwan chuckled uncomfortably. I don't want to vent my jealousy on you. Can you let me calm down first? Hearing the words jealousy, Mo Jingshin couldn't help smiling. Come here. Jinwan didn't want to go over, but seeing that he was about to stand up again, she hurriedly walked over. As soon as she approached, he held her waist with one hand and pulled her into his arms again. Jinwan wanted to get up, but he didn't move. He tightened his arms and kissed her brows. Nwan, Mo Jingshin planted another light kiss on the corner of her lips. The smile in his voice could not be concealed. You're jealous. Since I saw it, I can't pretend that nothing happened. Earlier, your nonchalant attitude was intentional, right? If you care, then care. Why are you pretending to be indifferent? I can't say that I'll really be jealous of an ex-girlfriend, and there's really nothing wrong with those photos. You shouldn't be jealous, Mo Jingshin said frankly. Mo Jingshin said frankly. Nothing happened between me and her. We didn't fall in love or kiss. Even the engagement was arranged by Shine Group. I just went through the motions, but not long after, the engagement was canceled. Between me and her, it was never what you think. Jinwan hadn't recovered from his words when she suddenly heard the man say in a low and heavy voice, You just said that you don't mind that I have a so-called past, that you don't mind that I've kissed, hugged, or even slept with others, and Jinwan, you're really magnanimous. Mo Jingshin suddenly chuckled. There was an indescribable danger in his tone. So, should I think of a way to give you a surprise? If I really had such a woman, I should really let the two of you have a good fight and see who's more powerful. Jinwan, no. She stiffened in his arms and shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. Chapter 327. Just now, I was just speaking casually. You can make your words sound so absolute. Mo Jingshin looked at her, his tone as cold as frost. You wish for a woman to lean on me like you do, to have the right to control my emotions and body, and I'll do my best to satisfy her. You wish for such a person? He then said coldly, or I can arrange a place for her like the U Garden. We can sleep in the morning and wake up at dusk, have 3 meals together, live together, and be more like you. On the sofa, on the bed, on the carpet, in the bathroom, in every corner of the room, we are intimately intimate. Would you still say you don't mind? Would you hesitate, even if you want to be jealous? Was this man deliberately using a knife to cut her heart? From the moment Jinwan received the photo last night to the moment she saw the ring, she kept telling herself not to be angry, not to mind, and that it was all right. But it turned out that a person's possessiveness could be so strong. It was so strong that even an analogy, an assumption, was like a blunt knife slowly grinding against her bones. The sharp pain seemed to instantly spread to her limbs and bones. Jinwan, can you accept all this magnanimously? Jinwan, wasn't he referring to herself as the one who wanted to save face and suffer? Jinwan suddenly seemed to deflate. She directly leaned her head against the man's shoulder, softly saying, I'm not willing. You can only belong to me. Screw his rationality. Screw his pride. Her own husband was hidden by herself. She would never give up this position to anyone who wanted to snatch it away. She raised her hands to hug his neck tightly, burying her face in his neck. She breathed in the clear scent of disinfectant on his body and snuggled even tighter in his embrace. Her voice was muffled as she said against his neck, If you dare to treat other women so well, I won't be able to get over it. And Mo Jingshun, let me tell you, between us, we will only be separated by death after 100 years. There will never be a separation of life. And Mo Jingshun abruptly held her chin, bending down to kiss her lips harshly. As he sucked on her lips repeatedly, he bit down on the tip of her tongue. She trembled and heard the man say hoarsely against her lips, Remember what you said earlier. Which one? The last one. Jinwan couldn't tell when she began to kiss Mo Jingshin. If it weren't for the fact that he couldn't move because of his injury, and if it weren't for the fact that she was pregnant, this man would have pressed her down on the hospital bed and done something to her. But even so, the man still tried his best not to tear his wound while pressing his body against hers. Jinwan originally wanted to say that this was a ward and that someone could come in at any moment, but the man's kiss was domineering and firm, accurately pressing against her lips. At first, he thought it was just a kiss, but it got out of hand. It wasn't until the buttons on the patient's gown were undone and the man's kiss landed on her fair neck that she suddenly shivered because of this unique stimulation. She gradually returned the kiss with her impulsive calmness. Ugh, don't. The man ignored her resistance and said, Don't move. This is a ward, and I'm pregnant. The man didn't say anything as he kissed her lips and cheeks. Jingshin, you're still injured? Ugh. It didn't matter if she was injured. What mattered was that she was pregnant and couldn't be touched in the first 3 months. Jinwan had just experienced a rush and now had to take good care of her body. She couldn't be careless at all, and she couldn't stand any more torment. The man pressed against her tightly, imprisoned her freedom, and kissed her collarbone and her shoulder. If he hadn't been injured, Jinwan would have pushed him away, but now she could only struggle carefully. Footsteps passed by from time to time outside the ward. Every time this sound approached, Jinwan would stiffen nervously, but the more she did this, the more the man's body rubbed against hers. They hadn't hugged each other deeply for so long, and her desire for him was no less than his, both mentally and physically. What's more, his kisses kept rolling over her neck, collarbone, and ears, making her calm and self-control gradually collapse. Mo Jingshin was obviously still rational. He restrained himself from continuing, but after all, he was very familiar with all the sensitive points of her body, and the two of them hadn't been together for a long time. So Jinwan quickly reacted. She whimpered under his touch and kiss. She abruptly buried her face in his neck, unable to suppress her breathing. She hoarsely begged, Jingshun, you don't miss me? And the man kissed her cheek, pressed his lips against hers, and said hoarsely in a low voice, This taste, it's really torture. The man's fingers had almost peeled off her hospital gown. The more turbulent he was, the faster he recovered his reason. His thin lips pressed against her ear, and he coaxed in a low voice, Sleep here with me tonight. Don't make me call you to come over again. I can't touch you or eat you, but at least let me hold you and see you. Jinwan's cheeks were hot from the man's teasing, and she slowly nodded against his neck. And the two of them spent the whole night in bed. To be exact, Jinwan was pressed on the bed by Mo Jingshin. Although it was inconvenient for him to do too much because of his injury, hugs and kisses were enough. Jinwan didn't know that a simple kiss could last for a long time. For example, a kiss could last for at least half an hour, and it didn't even feel monotonous. Jinwan didn't feel that she slept for long, but when she opened her eyes again, there was some light in the ward, which shone through the curtains and cast a dazzling light on the white quilt. "You're awake?" The man's voice came from her side. Jinwan turned her head and saw that Imo Jingshun, who was leaning against the headboard, had closed his laptop. He was only wearing the hospital gown loosely, and there was a suspicious red kiss mark on his neck, which was particularly eye-catching on his recently pale skin. Of course, Jinwan knew who did it. Although they did not do anything last night on this bed, after being teased for so long, she could not help but kiss him, nibble him, and bite him. She glanced at him and quickly shifted her gaze away. "What are you shy about?" Her little movement was naturally caught by the man, who chuckled. Chapter 328. Why didn't you say you were embarrassed when you kissed me last night? The man deliberately pulled open his clothes to show her the hickeys on his chest. "You bit me too," Jinwan argued in a low voice, but still reached over to tug at his clothes and buttoned him up one by one. However, even the top button couldn't cover the obvious hickey on his neck. "Really?" Mo Jingshin asked pretentiously and reached out to lift Jinwan's clothes. "Let me see." Jinwan was afraid that he would ignite the fire in her again early in the morning, so she rushed to lift the quilt and get out of bed. Mo Jingshin was injured and couldn't chase after her, so he didn't insist. He watched the little woman run out of the door with a blushing face as she fastened her clothes. However, Jinwan ran so fast that she forgot to take her cell phone. Before she opened the door, she suddenly heard the cell phone she left by his bed ring. She paused and looked back to see that the man was holding her cell phone calmly and looking at her. Jinwan rushed back. When she took the cell phone from his hand, she saw that it was Xiao Ba's number. She quickly cleared her throat and answered the call. "Hello. Boston One, are you up? It should be morning in the United States, right?" Xiao Ba asked cheerfully. "Yes, I'm up." Jinwan looked at the time. It was getting late in China. At least, it was time to get off work. Recently, the price of housing and land in China have been rising. The resources in our studio have been attracted by many big companies. These days, our conference room is almost full. Many people have come to bid for the studio. Sister Xiaotian said that when you come back, you can consider moving the studio out of Jinlin building and change to a formal, independent office building. Otherwise, those people who come to us with money will have no place to sit. Xiao Ba said with a smile. "Boss, before you come back, shall we help you find a suitable place in High City to move the studio?" It was already January, and the Chinese New Year was coming. In the new year, the trend of domestic housing prices had gradually begun to rise. I'll take a look when I get back. It's already so late, and you're still not off work?" "No, Sister Xiaotian left a little earlier today. She handed over some of the work on hand to me for the time being. I can get off work in about half an hour." "What is she doing?" Little Eighth suddenly chuckled. "Dating. Jinwan." She suddenly raised her eyebrows. "What kind of relationship does she have?" The last time Sister Xiaotian injured someone with her walking stick and was taken away by the police station, the police officer who interrogated her was also transferred from S City, and he was a special police officer who was temporarily transferred here. Xiaotian's family is also in S City, right? Recently, the two of them have been in close contact. Before Jinwan could come back to herself, Xiao Ba said that she was going to print some documents and get ready to get off work, so she hung up the phone. Jinwan held the phone for a long time before she understood. What was going on? Was this someone's spring? Xiaotian, who she had always been worried about, had finally opened up a new line of love, instead of maintaining the path of the scumbag from her previous life. But who was the police officer in the police station last time? At that time, the matter was too complicated and rushed, and she did not pay much attention to what the police officer in the interrogation room looked like. TSK, this woman Xiaotian actually made big news behind her back. No wonder she did not often send text messages to harass her these days. It turned out that she had changed the target of her complaints. Mo Jingshen lazily leaned against the headboard, watching Jinwan's somewhat complicated expression as though her good sister was about to be taken away by a wolf. "The studio is moving to a new location?" The man's light words brought Jinwan back to herself. Jinwan hurriedly shifted her gaze away from the hickey on his neck and after a moment of silence, she said, "Previously, the office location in Jinlin Building was only a temporary one. Now that there are more frequent investors and bidders, the environment of my small studio is indeed not good enough. If we really want to change the location, we may have to consider moving to a place near the construction bureau. That way, it will be closer and more convenient when we go to apply for documents in the future. Let Qin Siding help you choose a location. He often contacts people from the construction bureau." Mo Jingshan looked at Jin Wan's serious expression and chuckled softly. "In, Dr. Qin, will it be too much trouble for him?" "He can't wait for you to trouble him," Mo Jingshan casually said. "Recently, Shida Group has been making a lot of noise in China. The Qin family and Shida Group happen to be working together. He and his old love should see each other often. In these dark days, it's good to find something else for him to do." In the afternoon, Jin Wan went back to the ward to take a shower while Mo Jingshan was receiving an anti-inflammatory injection. In the past few days, she had been quite idle in the hospital. She ate, slept, bathed, and accompanied her husband. She didn't have to face the storm-like dangers of the past few days, nor did she have endless work waiting for them as soon as she opened her eyes in High City. However, when Jin Wan was taking a shower, she did not know that an uninvited guest suddenly came to the hospital. Mo Jingshan's injection was halfway through, and K of 11 Base was in charge of guarding outside the ward area with several brothers. Not long after, K suddenly knocked on the door and came in. "Mr. Mo, Miss Su is here." Mo Jingshan was still a little pale, but his face was cold and calm. "Didn't Nanheng tell you that no one from the Su family is allowed to come in?" "I know, so I didn't let Miss Su enter your ward area. She waited outside for a while. Seeing that we didn't let her in, she just left." Mo Jingshan closed his eyes again, and Kay suddenly remembered something and said, "By the way, just now, after Miss Su left, our men saw her go to Mrs. Mo's ward area. Although there are people guarding there, they used to be friends with Miss Su, so they may let her in." Mo Jingshan opened his eyes again and looked coldly at Kay. As soon as he met Mo Jingshan's cold eyes, Kay had a hunch that things were not good, so he immediately shut up and did not dare to say more. Mo Jingshan suddenly sat up, quickly pulled out the needle on the back of his hand under Kay's startled gaze, and lifted the quilt to get out of bed. However, because the surgical wound on his back hadn't healed after 3 days, his face turned pale because of the pain. Kay rushed to stop him, but Mo Jingshan had already gotten out of bed. Ignoring the trace of blood on the back of his hand dripping down the blood vessels because he pulled out the needle too quickly, he walked out expressionlessly. Chapter 329. Jin Wan was not surprised that Su Jilan came to the hospital. What was strange was that she couldn't sit still. They had just met in the milk tea shop, but in the blink of an eye, she came straight to the hospital. Jin Wan had just come out of the bathroom in the ward. Her hospital gown was a little loose, and the collar had not been completely fastened. She was drying her hair when she suddenly saw Su Jilan, who had pushed the door open and come in. "Miss Su." The moment she saw the other party, Jin Wan glanced at her in surprise. Su Jilan stood at the door of the ward and saw that Jin Wan had just taken a shower. She suddenly saw a red mark on Jin Wan's open chest. Her eyes flickered, and she looked away, saying calmly, "I thought someone was sick. I didn't expect that Miss G also has a ward. Do you have a cold, or are you not feeling well? I heard you were here, so I came to see you. Did I disturb you?" "Of course not. But if you had come a few minutes earlier, I might still be in the bathroom." Jin Wan dried her hair again, put down the towel, and casually tidied up her clothes, saying indifferently, "Miss Su, what's your purpose in coming to the hospital?" "I heard that Jingshan was injured." Jin Wan didn't stop smoothing her cuffs. She didn't even lift her eyelids. "Who told you the news?" Su Jilan smiled. "I have some connections with several people in Nanhang's base. After all, the Su family also has an important position in the American arms trade. But the Su family doesn't rely entirely on this business, so they haven't been involved in it in recent years. But 11 Base used to have a close relationship with the Su family, so it's not difficult for me to get some information from these acquaintances." Jinwan didn't respond and continued to smooth the creases on her cuffs. Last night, Mo Jingshin had pressed on her for almost the entire night. Her arm had been pressed down by him the entire time. Her clothes had clearly been washed yesterday, and she had just gotten a new set from the hospital. Yet after one night, it had become so wrinkled. Those who didn't know better would think that she had not changed her clothes for many days. Seeing that she was always so gentle and indifferent, Su Jilon suddenly smiled. "Miss G, you should know Jingshin's injury, right? Is he seriously injured? So many people from 11 Base are guarding the hospital, and I heard that even Officer Ince's men have been alarmed. I'm very worried about Jingshin's injury. If you're worried, just go to visit him. What are you doing here?" Jinwan raised her lips and looked at her with a faint smile. "Miss Su, since you're so familiar with the people in the base and treat them like your own people, I'm sure the people guarding outside his ward won't dare to stop you. You can visit him if you want. There's no need to explain to me about this kind of courtesy visit in the hospital. I won't mind an old friend of my husband's visit." Su Zhilan looked at Jinwan, and after a moment of silence, she said, "Their base is filled with new blood all year round, and there must be some people who don't know me. It's not convenient for me to go there rashly. What if I'm stopped?" Jinwan home, and Su Zhilan, G of her heart, and Wan, G of Zhilan, she, of, she of A. He had already experienced the awkwardness, so why did he come to her place to show his existence? New blood? The people on duty outside Mo Jingshin's ward were all veterans of the base, like Feng Lingke, and the others had been with Nanheng for many years. How could they not know Su Zhilan? That's true. It's indeed quite awkward to be blocked outside the door by someone you think you're close to. When she sat down, she picked up her cell phone and said absent-mindedly as she looked at the news that popped up on her cell phone, "I don't have anything to visit here. Besides, Miss Su, I'm not very familiar with you. Now that you've seen me, the air in the hospital is not good. You'd better go back early. I'll tell Jingshin about your visit. We appreciate your kindness." Jinwan didn't mean to be polite to her at all. She didn't even ask her to find a place to sit in the ward. However, Su Zhilan had no intention of leaving. She moved to the bedside and pointed to the chair on the opposite side. "May I sit down?" Jinwan was still looking at her phone. Without lifting her eyelids, she calmly responded, "If you want to sit, then sit. Miss G seems to be afraid of me." Su Zhilan took a look at her, took a chair, and sat down, sitting opposite Jinwan in a dignified manner. Hearing this, Jinwan burst out laughing. "I don't want to say too much, lest I hurt you." Su Zhilan raised her eyebrows and was about to speak when Jinwan put down her cell phone and looked up at her. Although Jinwan's hair was slightly wet and scattered on her back, and she looked particularly fresh and clean after taking a shower. Compared with Su Zhilan's beauty, Jinwan's attitude was neither hurried nor slow. In such a situation, Su Zhilan couldn't guess what Jinwan was thinking. She had personally tested Jinwan's bottom line and learned from Su Shui that Jinwan was a woman who looked simple but was not easy to deal with. It turned out that Jinwan was not affected by the photos and the ring at all. Su Zhilan hesitated and suddenly went straight to the point. "Miss G, you said you never knew of my existence before you received those photos. So do you know who I am now?" Jinwan glanced at her and lazily sneered. "You've already introduced yourself and taken out the engagement ring. There's no need to repeat your self-introduction. I'm not interested in your name and identity and have the patience to listen to it too many times." Seeing the calm look on her face, Su Zhilan paused for a moment, then suddenly curled her lips and said, "Miss G, although I didn't come with good intentions, I admit that my purpose is Jingshin. No one can accept the fact that a man you once loved has become the husband of a woman who came out of nowhere, but your attitude shows that you just want to cling to Mo Jingshin, and you don't care whether he has had other women or not, right?" Ji Yunshu said, "Miss G, although I didn't come with good intentions, I admit that my purpose is Jingshin." Chapter 330. Jinwan had thought that Su Zhilan was going to play this roundabout game with her for a while, and she thought this Miss Sue was strange and not decisive enough. Sure enough, people who were spoiled from childhood all had a common problem. That was, they didn't have enough patience. I'm afraid even Miss Sue isn't qualified to say whether I'm the exception or not. Jean Wan smiled, but there was no smile in her eyes. But I checked a ring on the internet that day. It's a masterpiece by a famous jewelry designer in the United States. It's indeed expensive, but I heard that the ring was auctioned by the Sue family at a charity party. Later, the Sue family took it and engraved the letters as NM on the ring, which represent you and Mo Jingshan, but it doesn't seem to be a real engagement ring. Jean Wan tilted her head slightly, and her voice was indifferent and languid. As a woman, seeing another woman so stubbornly in love with her husband and even carefully treasuring a meaningless ring with just an extra letter M on it for many years, it shows that my husband is still as charming as ever no matter how many years have passed. She paused for a few seconds and continued, but marriage is marriage. Miss Sue, even if you used to love him fiercely, that's a thing of the past. Why do you have to hold on to a shadow that you can't reach at all? Su Zhilan's face suddenly darkened. The ring was like a thorn in her heart. She had tried to show off, but in the blink of an eye, it became a kind of humiliation. She smiled calmly, and her delicate makeup and eyebrows were shrouded in a glaring mockery. When a person's confidence reaches a certain level, it's really hard to wake him up. Tell me, you don't even know who your biological father is, but you're the miss of the G family. Why do you have to stand by Mo Jingshan's side? Oh, now you can squander your confidence and scrupulously with the title of Mrs. Mo. Are you sure that a man like Jingshan will like you? If he didn't have other reasons, how could he marry you as soon as he returned to High City? Jean Wan was still smiling lightly, and no one could tell what she was thinking. Su Zhilan stared at her, and the aggression in her eyes was very obvious. Before I got together with Jingshan, he had never been intimate with any woman, and I was the man who broke all his firsts. As for you, you just happened to get married at the right time. As I said just now, if his wife were any other woman, he would treat her very well. You're not special, so don't be too confident. A man will always have a woman in his heart, but that woman obviously won't be you. Jean Wan raised her eyebrows and said in a clear voice, "You're standing in front of a man's legitimate wife and talking about feelings and the past with me? Just how desperate are you that you would use such a method to attack me?" Facing Jean Wan's unwavering attitude, Su Zhilan's eyes turned cold. "I'm reminding you to know what's good for you." Hearing this, Jean Wan was about to sneer when she heard Su Zhilan say coldly again, "Jingshan was seriously injured many years ago, and I stayed with him in the hospital to take care of him for a long time. Our relationship has always been stable. Now you accompany him day and night in the hospital. Have you ever thought that maybe he just regards you as my shadow?" Hearing this, Jean Wan suddenly smiled. A shadow that can't even enter his ward? As a shadow, your sense of existence is too low. As soon as Su Zhilan saw Jean Wan smile, she felt uncomfortable all over and tried to poke at her heart word by word. He won't have too much contact with any woman after marrying you because of his responsibility for his marriage. I know him very well. Mo Jingshan is a very principled and disciplined man, and his self-restraint is not comparable to that of ordinary people. Marriage is his shackles. Since he entered this prison, he has bound himself to this responsibility. But you can't guess whether he is willing to do this or not, can you? Jean Wan's smile made Su Zhilan feel uncomfortable all over, and she tried to poke at her heart with each word. I don't need to guess. Jean Wan was not hurt at all. She smiled carelessly and indifferently. In my world, as long as sweet things are sweet enough, I don't need to worry about whether the saccharin will become bitter or not. This kind of behavior of asking for trouble is usually the thinking of a psychopath. I'm a simple-minded person, and no one can instill any negative emotions in me. Miss Sue, I advise you to give up on me. If you have time, you'd better find a way to ask Kate to let you go in and talk to Mo Jingshan alone. Of course, that is if you can get in. Su Zhilan stared at Jean Wan, her fingers hidden under her bag gradually clenching. Jean Wan could see that she was really anxious. She was anxious to take advantage of their return to Los Angeles to do something to take back something, or to leave something in Mo Jingshan's life that had nothing to do with her at all. Leave what? Su Zhilan planned to become a snowball in Jinwan's heart step by step, and then roll in her heart like a snowball until it became an existence that could not be ignored. Because in this way, as long as Jinwan chose to quit, Mo Jingshan would no longer have the shackles and obstacles of marriage, and everything would be much easier. Unfortunately, Mo Jingshan had never given Jinwan a chance to have such a boring place in her heart. He would never allow any unforeseen accidents or misunderstandings. He had said all that should be said and explained, and he had always been as honest as he should be. As far as I know, the Ji family status in High City is not as good as before, is it? Su Zhilan stood up, walked slowly in the ward as if carelessly, and turned to look at Jinwan. In this situation, for the Su family, it's as easy as pinching an ant to make the Ji family go bankrupt. Now most of the industries in China are somewhat redundant, and it's very easy to replace something. What do you want to replace? For example, a few department stores that don't seem to have a good future, a listed company that is in debt, or like what? Suddenly, a low, cold voice rang from the door of the ward. Hearing this voice, Su Zhilan, who was standing by the bed facing Jinwan, suddenly paused and turned to look at Mo Jingshan, who had appeared out of nowhere. Jinwan didn't expect that Mo Jingshan would come. He couldn't leave the ward easily because of his injury, and wasn't he taking an injection just now? Why was he here? Kay didn't dare to speak after entering the door and stood behind Mo Jingshan. Chapter 331. Mo Jingshan's eyes were dark and indifferent, but his indifferent eyes soon made Su Zhilan feel a chill from the soles of her feet to the top and spread all over her body. Jinwan's smile disappeared because of his appearance. We'll let you out of the ward. Jingshan, after several years, she finally saw him standing in front of her instead of watching the financial news. Su Zhilan's composure suddenly cracked, and her eyes were glued to him. The man was dressed in a light blue hospital gown. He was as cold and handsome as ever. His face was obviously pale, but the coldness in the man's eyes was almost seeping out. He looked at her calmly with his dark eyes, without the slightest bit of politeness that an old friend should have. Seeing Mo Jingshan's pale face and the faint blood on the back of his hand, Jinwan guessed how he came here. Her heart clenched, and she was about to get up to help him, but the woman in blue, standing by the bed in front of her, quickly walked up to him. Jingshan, how are you hurt? Where on earth did you come back from? How did you get hurt like this? Su Zhilan looked concerned. She had come up to the man and was about to reach out to help him, when the man in front of her glanced at her coldly. Su Zhilan's hand, which was about to touch his arm, paused and hesitated before putting it down, but she clenched the bag in her hand. She couldn't hide the concern in her eyes, and her voice was gentle and sweet, not as cold and arrogant as when she was talking to Jinwan. I heard that you've been in this hospital for several days. You still look so pale after so many days. Where are you hurt? Is it very serious? Is it more serious than that time? What did you just say? Mo Jingshan didn't answer her question, but asked back in a low voice. The man's handsome face was calm and indifferent, and his eyes were distant. In Su Zhilan's view, his indifference was so sharp and silent that her nerves were trembling. What can I say? I came to see Miss G and care about the relationship between you and her. After all, I've been through it. After a moment of silence, Su Zhilan suddenly gave a natural smile and stared at the man's face, refusing to let go of any expression on his face, even if it was indifferent. Mo Jingshan was cold and indifferent. He did not plan on answering her words. He said softly, recently, Elder Su's thoughts haven't been in the right place. You clearly know that my place is a forbidden area to your Su family, but you still turn a blind eye to it and barge in? Being completely ignored in front of Jinwan, Su Zhilan had to calm down even if she was embarrassed. She looked at him, suddenly smiled, and then turned to Jinwan, whose face had darkened because of Mo Jingshan's appearance. After all, it's rare for you to be injured and hospitalized. I have more experience in taking care of you than Miss G. When you were in a coma, I have been watching over you. Now that I heard you were here and in the same hospital, I had to come and see you. Mo Jingshan didn't say anything at first. He just glanced at her coldly and then said in a cold voice, "If I remember correctly, when I was in a coma, I was taken care of by Nan Heng's men. Miss Su occasionally appeared when I was in a coma. I don't know if you have experience in taking care of people, but Miss G is my wife. It's natural for her to take care of me. Don't you worry too much." Su Jilan didn't speak. When she heard Mo Jingshan say that Jin Wan was his wife, her eyes were fixed on him. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "Jingshan, what I care about most now is your physical condition. As for who your wife is, Miss G has just repeatedly emphasized this matter to me. She has been reminding me all the time that she is now the winner. You are so injured, and I have no time to think about other things. The most important thing is you." Mo Jingshan's tone was still indifferent. "Do I need her to emphasize who my wife is to you again and again? Isn't it obvious to everyone? What I mean is, Miss G might be afraid that I might pose a threat to her, so she kept emphasizing her body." "Really? But why did I hear you just list a few examples in front of my wife?" Mo Jingshan's dark eyes coldly swept over Su Xue's face. "For example, using your most common means to control people with power and money? Do you think her temper is so soft that she would allow you to bully her like this? Didn't you see what happened to Su Xue? It doesn't matter if you lose a cousin, but do you want to lose yourself as well?" Jinwan really didn't think she was bullied. After all, she and Su Jilan were evenly matched. But when she suddenly heard these words from Mo Jingshan's mouth, she was so moved that she almost burst into tears. Su Jilan stared at the man's cold eyes. "You won't hurt me." At this time, the door of the ward was suddenly opened, and Nanheng, who had been listening outside for a long time, was standing there with his eyebrows raised. "I'm sorry. I found that no one was in the ward upstairs, so I came here to have a look, only to hear such a big drama." Nanheng glanced around with a faint smile and finally rested his eyes on Su Jilan, saying flatly, "I advise Miss Su to stay away from Jin Wan. Mo Jingshan treasures his wife very much, let alone your threats. Even if you appear in front of Jin Wan and affect her mood, it's enough to make him very unhappy with you." Su Jilan's eyebrows twitched. Obviously, she didn't expect that they all knew about the photos. Besides, Nanheng raised his hand and casually tidied up his cuffs. There was a cold sneer on the corner of his mouth, and he said slowly, "We didn't touch you back then because the Su family still had a certain status in the American arms industry. Both of us kept each other in check, and we're in the same boat. If the Su family didn't act rashly, we wouldn't either. But now, in order to protect himself, Elder Su has handed over everything in his hands. He was willing to be abandoned to protect the Su family's small territory in the business world. He has gotten what he wanted, but he has lost the condition to keep us in check." Hearing this, Su Jilan's suppressed calmness seemed to crack. She looked up at Mo Jingshan, who had been indifferent all this time. Chapter 332. Su Jilan's fingers trembled silently. She stared at the man with cold eyes in front of her. "My grandfather was forced to hand over those management rights because of you." Kay couldn't bear to listen anymore. Although he had met Miss Su before, when he saw her questioning Mr. Mo in such an attitude, he couldn't help interrupting. "Miss Su, Mr. Mo has been very kind to your Su family. If it weren't for the fact that Elder Su and Shine Group had a lot of mutual ties, the Su family would have faced more than just handing over the management rights. But Miss Su, it's not right for you to keep pestering him. You should have known it when Mr. Mo left the United States." "I don't understand." Su Jilan bit her lower lip and stared at Mo Jingshan's calm face. "So, was I used by you? You want to use me to break through the last barrier between you and the Su family? You want to ruthlessly squeeze the evenly matched party in your hands? Right now, the Su family can only be at the peak of their power in the righteous path, but they are blocked by you on the other path." Mo Jingshan's thin lips said calmly, "I didn't use you. Wasn't it Miss Su's deliberate deception? Me? What did I deceive you?" Su Zhilan's face suddenly tightened. Mo Jingshan's lips curved imperceptibly. When I was in a coma for many days, when I woke up, you stood in the ward and told a lie with my father. Don't you remember? Su Zhilan paused. You mean, I said I rescued you from the Los Angeles River? Jinwan, who hadn't participated in these things and had been a little confused, suddenly turned to look at Su Zhilan. Mo Jingshan indifferently withdrew his gaze from Su Zhilan's face. In order to cooperate with my father's selfish desire to keep me in the United States, the Su family and he made up a lie together, using the so-called kindness and friendship to facilitate our relationship. The corners of Mo Jingshan's lips lifted, his eyes filled with mockery. Since you have the guts to fabricate lies in front of me, you should be able to accept my way of repaying you. The Su family was shrewd, and I cooperated with you effortlessly. Coincidentally, the Su family had something I wanted, so I patiently played with you for 2 years. At the end of the day, Miss Su was used by her own grandfather. Even if this dirty water were to be poured on me, it wouldn't be my turn. Su Zhilan couldn't help but tremble harder. She wanted to say something, but when the words were on the tip of her tongue, she couldn't say them. She just looked at the man in front of her with red eyes. Why are you so sure that I was lying back then? At that time, you were covered in blood and barely had a breath left. I really drove there and sent you to the hospital. Jingshun, I can understand that you have prejudice against the Su family, but you can't deny my feelings for you. Are you sure you want to continue making up this useless story? Mo Jingshan's cold voice rang in front of her. Due to his poor condition, the man's voice was low and cold. Jinwan sat on the bed, silently wanting to swear. Although it might not be particularly important whether she had saved him or not, and she really didn't take it to heart, what they had experienced for so long could not be summed up by such a small thing. But Miss Su was really confident to lie so blatantly. She didn't expect that the man was sitting here watching, did she? Mo Jingshan's attitude was so firm and cold that all the explanations on the tip of Su Zhilan's tongue seemed to become so tasteless in an instant. She was silent for a moment, looked at the man's eyes that were as calm as the sea, and gradually softened her voice. Jingshan, no matter what the reason is, we used to be together. You can't be so heartless. Mo Jingshan's lips curved into a cold smile. Before you sent Jinwan that doll in the wedding dress, if I had touched the Su family in the slightest, I would have been heartless. The warning in his words was clear enough. Touching Jinwan was tantamount to touching his bottom line. He could do heartless things once and twice. Even if he was accused of being heartless, he would not let go of the Su family easily. Su Zhilan couldn't help saying, Miss G is not a child. Why is she so delicate? It's just a prank. Can a few blades turn the world upside down? She then said unwillingly with red eyes, even what Su Shui did was just a fight for me. But all of you were so ruthless towards her that it's already a miracle that she's still alive. And you just strangled the Su family's lifeline, made it difficult for the Su family to move forward, and had my grandfather lock me up. Mo Jingshan, I've been by your side for 2 years, loved you, and waited for you for so many years. And this is how you treat me? Mo Jingshan closed his eyes, and there was a trace of paleness and impatience between his brows. Su Zhilan saw that he couldn't bear it for so long. After a moment of silence, she softened her voice. Jingshan, don't be angry. I'll help you back to the ward first. You're still. With that, she hurriedly reached out to help him. Mrs. Mo. Kay suddenly winked at Jinwan. Seeing that Mo Jingshan avoided Su Zhilan's hand, but Su Zhilan insisted on helping him, Jinwan pursed her lips, got up, and put her hand on Mo Jingshan's arm. Mo Jingshan leaned toward her. Obviously, he couldn't hold on any longer. How many times has the doctor told you not to get out of bed these days? Did you pull out the needle yourself? Don't you feel any pain at all? Jinwan was standing closest to Mo Jingshan now. When most of the man's body almost leaned toward her, she couldn't help muttering beside him. What if the wound has a problem again? Aren't you afraid that the wound will be inflamed repeatedly, leading to infection and fever, and finally burn into a fool? Kay, who was standing behind, She was really CEO Mo's wife. Why didn't she learn to be gentler than Miss Su at a time like this? How could she insult Mr. Mo? Su Jilan watched Mo Jingshun leaning against Jin Wan defenselessly and suddenly looked at Jin Wan's face. For a moment, Jin Wan seemed to see some kind of determination and coldness in her eyes. Although it flashed away, obviously she was not the only one who saw it. Chapter 333. Jin Wan raised her hand and held Mo Jingshun's arm, noticing that at that moment, he seemed to have intentionally moved in front of her. She remembered that Feng Ling had said that Miss Su had intermittent mania, but Su Jilan couldn't be so irrational as to do anything out of line in such a place. At the same time, Mo Jingshun took Jin Wan's hand and held it, silently giving her a sense of steadiness and peace, not letting her be affected by these things. Their movements didn't escape Su Jilan's eyes. Su Jilan looked at their interlocked hands and said bitterly, "Jingshun, we've been together for 2 years. I've worked overtime with you, and I've gone on business trips with you. You and I have experienced as much as Jin Wan. I've been honest with you. I didn't mean to lie to you, but it's unfair for you to deny my feelings for you. I've been waiting for you for so many years." Enough. Mo Jingshun's pale face added more indifference to his clear and cold look. Starting with a lie is doomed to have no ending. Miss Su's feelings are just your obsession. I don't owe you anything, and I don't need to be responsible for you. Go. Don't embarrass yourself too much. Miss Su. Kate consciously took it as Mr. Mo's order, so he immediately approached Su Jilan and said politely, "Mr. and Mrs. Mo are not in good health now. Please leave." Su Jilan nodded and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Mo, please leave." Su Jilan still wanted to speak, but Kay stood in front of her. Su Jilan's hands kept shaking. She tried to control her emotions, but the sadness in her eyes was very obvious. The atmosphere here was really not good for her. She took a deep breath and said, "Okay, I'll go back. Jingshun, take care of yourself. When you're discharged from the hospital, I'll Miss Su, please." Before she finished speaking, Kay, who had been standing in front of her, reached out to the door. Su Jilan clenched her fingers, managed to maintain the last trace of demeanor, and walked out. Kay decisively blocked her view all the way to prevent her from looking into the ward. When the two of them walked away, Nan Hung, who had been leaning against the door of the ward, glanced at Mo Jingshun, whose face was frighteningly pale. "Are you sure you can hold on?" As soon as he finished speaking, Mo Jingshun couldn't answer him at all. With Jin Wan's cry of surprise, the man in front of her leaned toward her. She rushed to hold him. Jin Wan was startled. She immediately tightened her grip on him, afraid that he would fall. Nan Hung frowned and turned to call the nurse. When the doctor and nurse came over and hurriedly helped Mo Jingshun up, Jin Wan looked at the blood on her hand, and then at the blood oozing from the back of Mo Jingshun's light blue hospital gown. Her heart skipped a beat. His ward was 4 floors away from hers. Su Jilan hadn't been here for long, and he had suddenly come. How on earth did he get the news, pull out the needles, and come here? His injury wasn't just a simple flesh wound. He had heard from the doctor that the sharp part of the gun but didn't hurt his bones, but the wound was so deep that the bone could be seen. It wasn't easy for him to recuperate for 2 or 3 days. When it was almost healed, he got out of bed again. It was getting dark. "Jin Wan, you're really a jinx." Outside the ward, Nan Hung looked at the woman standing in front of the door with a sigh. Jin Wan, after Mo Jingshun was brought back to the ward by the medical staff, the wound was retreated, the bleeding was stopped, and the medicine was applied. As she said, Mo Jingshun's wound was sore and the inflammation had not subsided. A few hours later, Mo Jingshun began to have a high fever, and his temperature soared to 40 degrees. If he hadn't been in the hospital, he might really have been burnt out if the fever had been delayed any longer. The medical staff was still in the ward, so Jin Wan couldn't go in now. She could only stand outside and accept the baptism of Nan Hang's eyes. "I've been watching him every moment of the day and told him not to move, but when I went back to the ward to take a shower, you all forgot to keep an eye on him." Kay didn't dare to stop him, and the others didn't know to stop him either. Didn't they know that the wound on his back would have a problem if he came out like this? So what if I stopped him? It's your own man who is scared today. How can you blame it on me? Jin-Wan glared at him. I've just been bombarded by my ex-girlfriend and stimulated physically and mentally, and faced with my husband's high fever and coma. Can you take my mood into consideration and comfort me a little? Nan-Hung rolled his eyes at her. I don't see how you've been stimulated by your ex-girlfriend. Jin-Wan also glared at him. I haven't had time to be stimulated, but the person you failed to stop has rushed into the ward. You want to be stimulated, don't you? Nan-Hung raised his cold eyebrows. If you're willing to listen, I don't mind telling you how Mo Jingshin and Su Jilan got together. No matter how sincere and how insincere they were, Miss Su is right. They've been together for 2 years, and it's not impossible for them to forget each other. It's not impossible for them to fall in love with each other over time. I don't want to listen. Jin-Wan looked resolute. Didn't you just say you want to be stimulated? I find that since Mo Jingshin and I got together, you've been particularly against us. I'm not interested in Su Jilan's past, but I'm very interested in you now. Why are you interested in me? You act as if you'll die if you don't say something to me every day. I always feel as if I've robbed your man. Nan-Hung, do you have feelings for Mo Jingshin? Jin-Wan looked at him meaningfully, and when Nan-Hung choked on the cigarette and coughed several times, she glanced at Feng Ling, who had just come out of the elevator. Nan-Hung was coughing hard. Feng Ling came over, took a strange look at him, and then looked at Jin-Wan flatly. Mrs. Mo, I've arranged for other people to guard your ward. No one will disturb you in the future. Jin-Wan nodded. In fact, if it had been anyone else, they wouldn't have been able to get in. After all, Su Jilan had been friends with them before, so it was understandable that they didn't dare to block her blatantly. Chapter 334. Understanding the meaning behind Jin-Wan's words, Feng Ling said, We'll investigate those people. Right now, they've already been replaced. Don't worry. Not long after, the doctor came out of the ward. He said that Mo Jingshin had been given an injection to reduce his fever, but his fever was still obvious. His body temperature was only under 39 degrees, and he was still running a high fever. In the next few hours, before his fever completely subsided, someone would have to stay up all night to take care of him and lower his body temperature. They would also have to feed him warm water frequently. With Jin-Wan here, naturally, no one would snatch this task from her. In the dead of the night, Nan-Hung returned to the base. Feng Ling rested on the long bench outside the ward. The room was quiet. Mo Jingshin was still sleeping. His complexion was different from when he was running a high fever. Right now, his body temperature had dropped slightly. The man's usually handsome face was pale. He was sleeping too quietly. Jin-Wan felt even more anxious in her heart. She did not know when his injuries would completely recover. She reached out to touch his forehead. It was indeed still very hot. Jin-Wan stood up to bring in a new ice pack that the nurse had just brought in. After holding it in her hand for a while, she carefully placed it on his head. Although Mo Jingshin was unconscious, he did not seem to be sleeping well. Due to the coldness on his head, he unconsciously furrowed his brows. Jin-Wan gently placed her hand on his shoulder, patting him gently as she said, You're running a fever. Sleep well. Right now, you don't have to worry about anything. You just need to sleep well and bring your fever down as soon as possible. She was not sure if her words were effective or if Mo Jingshin was not too awake, but not long after she spoke, the man's breathing returned to normal. He had already fallen into a deep sleep. Such an obedient Mo Jingshin. If not for his worrying pale complexion, Jin-Wan would have found him slightly adorable. His appearance when he was asleep was completely different from when he was awake. In this world, it was likely that not many people would have the opportunity to see such a fragile, quiet, and defenseless Mo Jingshin. Jin-Wan pulled a chair over and sat by the bed. From time to time, she touched his head and hands and occasionally used the electronic thermometer to measure his temperature. For 2 consecutive hours, she tried to find a way to feed him warm water and wipe his palms and neck with a towel dipped in warm water. 2 hours later, Mo Jingshin's body temperature finally dropped to around 37 degrees. After confirming that his fever was gone, Jinwon carefully removed the ice pack from his head and gently wiped his face. She then sat by the bed and watched him sleep under the faint light of the ward. The man's face was still pale. He just lay quietly on the bed. The bruise on his brow bone a few days ago had disappeared. His clean appearance had an inexplicable kind of sickly beauty. She recalled how this man had stood in her hospital room during the day and treated Su Zhilan with no emotion. He was so cold that he seemed to be able to isolate himself from all other women except for her. Jinwon supported her chin with one hand and leaned against the edge of the bed. She watched the man's sleeping face and gently held his hand. She slowly and gently intertwined her fingers with his, palm against palm. Jinwon did not know how she had fallen asleep. When she suddenly woke up, she felt that her head was slightly heavy. She abruptly raised her eyes and met the man's ink-black eyes. "When did you wake up?" Feeling that his hand had unknowingly touched her head, Jinwon rushed to sit up straight and raise her hand to gently pull it down. She felt the temperature of his hand and confirmed that his fever was no longer rising. Only then did she relax. "I actually fell asleep. Wait a moment. I'll go call the doctor." "There's no need to call the doctor. Your fever has already subsided. What's the point of calling them?" Mo Jingshin held her hand and did not let her go. "You had a high fever last night and only went down after midnight. Let the doctor come and check. It's just an infection. I'll just take a few more days of anti-inflammatory medicine and injections. There's no need to make such a big fuss." The man's voice was lower than a few days ago, but each word was clear. "You took care of me for an entire night. Have you forgotten that you're pregnant? There are senior nurses in the hospital, but if they're here, it won't be convenient for me to come in to see you. Besides, your fever was too serious last night. If I'm not here, I won't be able to sleep. I might as well stay here to watch over you." Jinwon smiled and habitually touched his forehead. "Then I'll call Feng Ling to buy some food." Feeling his body temperature, Jinwon sat by the bed with a sigh of relief and rubbed her face against his palm. She said with dim eyes, "Don't do this again in the future. I'm afraid that the wound will become infected, and you pulled out the anti-inflammatory needle. In fact, whether it's Miss Su or anyone else, it doesn't matter. Even if you want to protect me, you have to see if your body can take it. I'm not a little white flower that can be easily bullied. As long as I'm firm enough, no one can do anything to me. But now that you're injured like this, if we stand outside and are blown by the wind, the first one to fall will definitely be you. No matter how powerful you are, you have to know your limits now, okay? You speak as if I'm already so old that I can't get out of bed with a little injury. I'm not that fragile." The man chuckled lightly. "TSK, then get out of bed if you have the ability. If you have the ability, don't let the wound get infected. An inflamed high fever is more serious than a normal cold. It's really scary to have a fever of 40 degrees Celsius and be unconscious." Jinwon picked up a hospital note by the side. On it was written the temperature she had recorded when she helped him take his temperature several times last night. "Look at it yourself. If I had a fever like this, wouldn't you be angry at me for not taking care of my body?" Mo Jingshin glanced at it and did not argue with her. He gently patted her hand, asking mildly, "Where's Nan Hung?" "He returned to the base last night. I don't know if he has come to the hospital yet. Are you looking for him?" Jinwon placed the note back and turned to pour him a cup of warm water. "You took care of me here for an entire night last night. Rest well today. Call Nan Hung for me." "All right, I'll call him in a bit. Lie down and don't move." Jinwon brought the cup over and fed him a few mouthfuls of water with a spoon. Mo Jingshin felt somewhat helpless because of her careful feeding him water. Right now, Jinwon was quite obsessed with feeding him. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.